Listen, for we begin at the edge of memory, where the world was still young enough that the gods walked in disguise and men carried destinies like burdens and prizes. The call to Troy is not a single moment but a braided sequence of motives, prophecies, and small decisions that swelled into a war whose ripples shaped the songs sung for centuries. Think of it as a slow gathering of weather, clouds colliding on horizons, each darkening the next until storm breaks over the Aegean and the wooden hulls set forth. This is the origin story of an epic journey, the origin of a tale that will later be called the Odyssey by the very journey it inspired. The first threads lead us back to a wedding that was too splendid for the gods to ignore and too exclusive for chaos to tolerate. Peleus, a mortal king, courted Thetis, a sea nymph whose beauty and destiny caused Zeus himself to hesitate. They married on the shore with gods and heroes as guests, and in a moment of divine oversight, imbued with that mixture of pride and mischief that defines myth, Eris, goddess of strife, was excluded from the feast. Her revenge would be small in appearance and enormous in consequence, a single golden apple inscribed with the word for the fairest. When the apple appeared, three goddesses each thought the word meant her. Hera, queen of heaven, thought herself the rightful bearer. Athena, goddess of craft and war, felt justice and wisdom gave her claim, and Aphrodite, goddess of love, believed that beauty alone was enough. They argued with a kind of polite ferocity only immortals can sustain, and the quarrel could not be settled by immortals alone. Zeus, weary of choosing and wary of the consequences, appointed Paris of Troy to be judge, sending the crisis into human hands and thereby ensuring the mortals would inherit a portion of what had been divine folly. Paris himself is a study in exile and unexpected consequence. Born to King Priam of Troy, he was exposed on a mountain as an infant because of an oracle's fearful warning that he might be the ruin of his city. He survived, of course, found and raised by shepherds, growing into a youth who was as far from courtly life as any prince could be. When fate called, it did so gently and deceptively, a contest of appearance and speech that would not simply decide a prize but tilt the balance of nations. The judgment of Paris unfolded with the subtle cruelty of a test. Each goddess offered Paris a bribe in the language she best knew. Hera offered sovereignty and political power, Athena offered wisdom and glory in war, and Aphrodite offered the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, swayed by the promise of desire, awarded the apple to Aphrodite and thus secured for himself the favor of love over the favor of might. That choice was not a mere romantic blunder, it was a pivot that made destiny moral and emotional, binding the human to the divine through attraction and envy. Aphrodite's promise led Paris to Helen, who was already bound by marriage to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Helen's beauty is a recurring theme in the stories, described in the poetry as a force so compelling that ships were launched and men were made into shadows for its sake. Accounts vary, she may have been seduced, abducted, or persuaded to leave willingly, but the result was the same. Helen's departure was seen as an affront that could not stand. Menelaus's humiliation and rage would grow into a summons to arms, and the offense would be measured not simply in stolen property but in honor, which in the world of heroes is as real as land or life. But the Greeks were not a single people under a single banner. Their world was a tapestry of city kings, loyalties, family ties, and personal oaths, and yet there was a mechanism that could bind them together when honor demanded it. That mechanism was the Oath of Tyndareus, a compact forged to secure brideship and to prevent internecine strife among suitors. Before Helen married Menelaus, her suitors were many and powerful, and Tyndareus, wanting stability, extracted oaths from them. Should any suitor be wronged, the others would support him in righting that wrong. It is this ancient promise that turns a private grievance into a collective expedition, making the Spartan complaint a national call. The call then became an assembly of names and reputations. Agamemnon, brother of Menelaus and king of Mycenae, seized the moment to translate family quarrel into sovereign command. He sent envoys across the Greek world, invoking oaths and appealing to pride. The vow of the suitors made men like Odysseus, Ajax, Nestor, and Achilles answer not merely because they wanted plunder, but because the social web of honor required them to do so. In that sense, the war is both a legalistic fulfillment and a fevered expression of the desire for Cleo's fame, so crucial to heroic identity. Odysseus's role in all this is uniquely clever and quietly pivotal. He is described as a man of many wiles, a strategist whose mind turns like windlasses in a ship's hold. When Tyndareus feared the consequences of offending any suitor by choosing Menelaus, it was Odysseus who proposed a cunning solution: have every suitor swear to uphold the chosen marriage, and in return he would abstain from claiming Helen. Odysseus's maneuver saved Sparta from immediate bloodletting and bound the Greek elites into a compact that would later become the structural skeleton of the Trojan expedition. His involvement begins as pragmatism and ends as destiny. He is both architect and victim of the oath he helped construct. Yet oaths and strategies lie beside deeper currents that pull men and gods alike: prophecy, fate, and the will of the divine. Seers and oracles played their part in the build-up to Troy, spinning words that both constrained and liberated choice. An oracle in Phocis predicted that whoever first touched Trojan soil would return dead, and so the heroes knew risk as well as reward. Prophetic pronouncements were less prescriptions than theaters where choice was performed. People could try to outmaneuver fate, but the very act of trying often brought them closer to its design. The gods themselves were not monolithic in their support or opposition. Each deity had preferences, grudges, and loves that bent events like reeds. Athena tended toward the Greeks, angered at Paris's judgment that slighted her. Apollo favored Troy, sometimes openly and sometimes through subtle intercession. Hera, wounded by Paris's dismissal, allied with the Achaeans. Aphrodite, proud of her reward, protected Paris and Helen. These divine partialities turned mortal plans into an arena of cosmic chess, where human cunning met immortal caprice with dramatic consequences. Men were pawns and kings all at once. Their fates were played out in a space where gestures by a god could sink a whole fleet or keep a single man safe. Agamemnon's call became a dragnet, sweeping up men for whom war meant everything: wealth, glory, rescue of honor. Some answered eagerly, sharpened by a lust for exaltation, others with reluctance and a sense of dread. Achilles, the greatest of the Greeks in combat, was pulled into the orbit of the war by his complex relationships with mortality and glory. He was the son of the sea goddess Thetis and the mortal Peleus, a figure who could have lived in obscurity or risen to such fame that songs would freeze him into eternity. The prophecy concerning Achilles was stark and simple: a short life with eternal fame, or a long life with nothing to sing of. Choosing between them set one of the central engines of the epic into motion. The tender and turbulent figure of Achilles captures the paradox that drives so much of the tragedy. To be remembered is to be made a story, and to be a story can cost the life that makes the story possible. He is the young warrior who wants honor and resists command. He is also a son and friend, bound by loyalties that the war will test. His relationship with Patroclus, his quarrels with Agamemnon over spoils, and his heel's fatalism are threads that connect personal pride to the grander tapestry of war. Every hero who answered the call stepped into concentric circles of motive, family, honor, gift, greed, each ring adding weight to the decision to sail. The Greek fleet itself became a moving city, a mobile civilization that stretched in a line across the sea. Ships were the arteries of the age, carrying men, horses, arms, and the social codes that made them one force rather than many. Leaders bargained with local lords, negotiated contributions, and gathered not only soldiers but craftsmen, soothsayers, and priests. The departure from home was ceremonial and chaotic, sacrifices to gods, tearful farewells, and the clanging of oars as families watched their sons recede into the blue. Ports, small islands, and famous harbors saw the lines of men pass with the gravity of something historically inevitable and painfully intimate. Before the fleet sailed in full, there were smaller tragedies and omens that hinted at what war would demand. Odysseus, whose name means the first in the fight, is a shadow at the margins of the story, the first Greek to leap ashore at Troy and the first to fall. His death became an omen that braided heroism and loss. He was mourned with rites and remembrances that would be repeated across generations. Sacrifices were offered, seers intoned warnings, and soothsayers like Calchas made pronouncements that cut away illusions and revealed the raw cost of honor. The Greeks learned early that glory's light cast a deep shadow. Troy itself was no passive stage, but a living city with its own structures of power and narrative. Ruled by King Priam and his sons, it was a place of walls and merchant wealth, of alliances that reached beyond Lydia and into Anatolia. The Trojans were as varied as the Greeks: farmers, craftsmen, warriors, and noble families tied into the same fate as their invaders. Paris's choices had ruptured not only households but also networks of marriage and trade, and the reaction of Troy to the Greek armada was not simply fear but the gathering of its own energies and gods. The city had its champions, foremost among them Hector, who embodied the civic response to an existential threat. Hector, the noblest Trojan, stood as a counterweight to Achilles in many ways. Where Achilles was individual brilliance, Hector was civic duty incarnate. He loved his family, his city, and the plain facts of duty. His speeches to wives and children, his debates with his father, Priam, cast him as the moral spine of Troy. When war came, Hector's choices were threaded with a sense of the communal. His fights were not for personal immortality but for the continued life of the city that sustained him. The contrast between Hector and Achilles is crucial to the origin story of the Odyssey because it maps two models of heroism, one who returns if he can, and one who will not return but will be sung forever. But the beginning of the war, the call to Troy, demanded more than swords and oaths. It required the sanction of cult and ritual. Sacrifices were made to Zeus for a favorable wind and to Athena for clever strategy. Priests chewed barley and threw omens, blood was offered and supplications made, and the rituals themselves were a kind of guarantee that the violence would be sewn into the fabric of the sacred. The Greeks believed that without ritual backing, their cause would be hollow, a mere theft of lives rather than a right of justice. Thus every ship that slipped its moorings did so under the watchful gaze of both mortals and immortals, bound by gestures ancient and meaningful. One cannot tell the call to Troy without pointing to the oral tradition that polished the story into song. Before Homer, or at least before the epics we attribute to him, these narratives were passed by men who remembered phrasing like musicians remembering notes. Bards carried versions from hall to hall, changing lines, adding names, embellishing battles. The epics grew like reefs under tidal insistence, accreting detail and brushing into the culture's consciousness. This oral composition meant the story of the war, the motives, and the characters were flexible and multifaceted. Each teller emphasized what mattered to his audience. The Odyssey, then, is both a memory and a revision, a late bloom of a tale that had been alive for generations. Archaeology has its own way of speaking to the legend, through layers of pottery and collapsed walls in a place we now identify as Hizarlik, a mound in modern Turkey. Excavations by Schliemann and later archaeologists found traces consistent with a city that suffered destruction in the Bronze Age, possibly aligning with the era when such a conflict could have occurred. Scholars debate dates and scale. pointing to evidence of fire and ruin, and to the wide trade networks that would have made Troy a prize worth the trouble. While the archaeological Troy cannot confirm every detail of myth, deities are stubbornly absent from strata. It suggests that the memory of a catastrophic siege fed the stories that later poets would make glorious. The human motives behind the war are as varied as the faces in the Greek fleet. Some leaders sought land and the tangible rewards of conquest, others pursued personal slights or familial obligations. Economic factors played a role too. Control of trade routes and influence in the eastern Mediterranean could be as compelling as any love quarrel. But perhaps the truest and most enduring motive is simpler and more tragic: the pursuit of fame and the avoidance of shame. In a world where reputation was currency, the call to Troy allowed men to buy a kind of immortality at the price of their lives. Once the war was launched, it became an engine that consumed identity and forged it anew. The heroes who sailed saw themselves through the lens of possible death as much as possible victory. Battles give rhythm to an epic, but so do the small human moments: a mother weeping, a handshake between comrades, a lover's farewell. Those intimate glimpses are the threads that make the tapestry compelling, reminding us that epic events are made of private choices. The Odyssey picks up precisely where such choices leave off, in the long shadow of a war whose beginning was as much domestic as cosmic. Language plays its own role in the origin. The diction of Homeric verse preserved a world with inherited formulas and repeated phrases that shaped the way characters and events were remembered. Phrases like rosy-fingered dawn or wine-dark sea are not mere decoration. They are mnemonic devices coded into the oral tradition to help reciters hold a long tale in memory. They also create a shared aesthetic that allows listeners to inhabit the same world, leaning into familiar structures while absorbing new variations. Such repetition made the call to Troy something one could expect, as if the world were narrating itself into existence. In this web of cause and custom, Odysseus stands as a man uniquely poised between domestic ties and the broader tug of war. King of Ithaca, husband to Penelope and father to Telemachus, he could have remained home, tending his gardens and ruling a small island. Yet his role in the Oath of Tyndareus, his personal ambition, and his nature pulled him into the conflict. He leaves not because he is careless, but because he is cunning and because the social fabric requires his presence. His absence and eventual return will be the very axis upon which the Odyssey spins. The departure itself is a meditation on loss disguised as a step toward glory. Husbands and sons, brothers and fathers clasp one another. Women keep silent the tears that will make them vulnerable to mockery. There are rituals that bless the leaving and gestures that confirm it: libations to the god of the sea, spikes of iron plunged into the sand, litanies. And then, as if pulled by a common breath, the oars dip and the fleet becomes a ribbon crossing the sea. For those on board, the horizon is both a promise of fame and a shutter closing on what they leave behind. Once the Greeks landed on Trojan soil, the nature of warfare shifted from formal challenge to grinding attrition, from heroic single combat to camp life and siegecraft. Stories of duels, the kind in which heroes like Hector and Ajax test each other, are interleaved with the daily horrors of tents, firewood, and disease. The long standoff at the walls of Troy created a time for men to reveal the depth of their characters: courage, fear, compassion, and cruelty in equal measures. And in these quiet moments the seeds of the Odyssey were sown, for the returning home would reveal who a man was when the drums of war fell silent. The role of women in these origins is complex and deeply human. Helen is often cast as the cause of war, but she is also a figure of sympathy and contradiction, a woman prized for her beauty yet reduced to an object in many tales. Women like Hecuba, Priam's wife, and Andromache, Hector's spouse, show the private costs of public violence, lives eroded by the grinding machinery of war. Meanwhile, Penelope remains the image of home as not merely a place, but an ongoing labor of fidelity and wit. The home front in these stories is not passive, it is active, moral, and sometimes decisive. The Trojan horse, although famous, belongs to the later stratagems that conclude the war rather than to its initiation. Nevertheless, it is useful to reflect on how cunning shapes the whole enterprise. Deceptive devices, secret speeches, and secret honors were as much a part of the Greeks' identity as battlefield valor. Odysseus's mind, already present at the war's beginning, becomes the origin of the very strategy that will end the war. The use of guile in place of brute force suggests a cultural valuation of intelligence as a path to Cleos, and this valuation follows Odysseus into his long wanderings. Prophecy loops through the narrative like a repeating motif, telling men what they might do but rarely telling them how to do it well. Calchas, the seer, predicts conditions and compels sacrifices. Other soothsayers read entrails and stars for signs. Their pronouncements often come at the price of social upheaval. The sacrifice of Iphigenia by Agamemnon is a stark example where religious duty and personal catastrophe fuse. That sacrifice, ordered to secure winds for the fleet, stains Agamemnon's household with grief and sets in motion a cycle of vengeance that will haunt many returning to Ithaca. It demonstrates how divine commands, human pride, and pragmatic decisions often entangle until no straight line can be drawn between cause and consequence. The theme of honor versus life is a recurring logic that pushes men toward Troy. To refuse the summons to fight was to invite scorn and hazard one's status, to go meant risking everything. Each hero faced a negotiation between the safety of the hearth and the uncertain banquet of fame. For some, like Achilles, the choice was ego and destiny at once. This logic is essential for understanding why so many distinct personalities, with different loyalties and lives, converged on a single place with such ferocity. The call to Troy is less a sequence of orders than a moral atmosphere that compelled action. The geography of the voyage matters in our story because islands and coasts acted as stages for decisive incidents. Stops at Aulis, where the fleet waited for wind, and at other waypoints like Tenedos, became narrative moments. These sites are where leaders argued, lovers parted, tempers flared, and portents appeared. They are liminal spaces, neither home nor battlefield, where decisions sat like loaded flint, ready to ignite. For an audience listening in a car or at work, imagining these shorelines lends texture to the human psychology of the build-up. The economy of gifts and spoils plays a subtle but powerful role in assembling the expedition. Kings promised lands, ships, and shares of booty to secure support from lesser chieftains and from mercenary crews. Material incentives validated the emotional and juridical obligations of the Oath of Tyndareus, translating honor into reward and vice versa. Yet the antiquity of the period meant that gifts were also symbolic tokens of reciprocal obligation. A sword or a cup established social bonds that would be called upon in the war's long months. These material cultures are a whisper beneath the grand speeches, explaining the structural back and forth that made a dispersed people into an army. The oral poets who preserved these memories were not passive registrars but active interpreters, and their emphasis shaped which origins persisted. Some versions lingered on the divine provocations, others focused on human folly. The storytellers tailored the narrative to their audiences, aggrandizing local heroes, extenuating certain crimes, and amplifying particular lessons. Over time, this performance tradition consolidated the war's causes into a story with moral contours that the Homeric epics would later solidify. It is why the call to Troy, though grounded in a tangle of causes, reads in poetry as both inevitable and instructive. Contextual history also sharpens the image. The late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean was an arena of shifting powers, where Mycenaean palaces, Hittite statecraft, and Minoan networks jostled for advantage. Political reality could easily turn personal slights into strategic crises. A princely elopement could threaten trade routes and alliances, giving greater material explanation to a war often dressed in romance. The collapse of palace economies in the later Bronze Age may even have given the mythic memory of strife a historical anchor. When systems fail, stories of catastrophe multiply to make sense of the loss. Even the language of heroism and shame in the epics carries deeper social signals. Shame is communal. An insult to one man is an affront to his kin, his lord, and his network. Conversely, the chance to prove oneself in war is an opportunity to elevate one's household and to secure a name that will echo in song. These cultural codes do not excuse violence, but they explain how inertia and reputation can combine to create conflicts that are disproportionate to their initial causes. The call to Troy, therefore, should be heard as the multiplication of small wounds into a wound large enough to take an entire society as its patient. As ships left, communities on Ithaca and beyond rearranged themselves to survive in their absence. Women took on roles that would otherwise belong to absent husbands. Younger men seized temporary authority. Such adjustments created a tension upon return. The home may have recovered, adapted, or been transformed in ways that complicated a hero's reintegration. The Odyssey is preoccupied with this very failure of simple return. So understanding the call's domestic impact helps explain why Odysseus's journey home is not merely nautical but fundamentally social and legal. Those displaced by war return to changed landscapes, not simply geographic ones. The notion of divine retribution and favor is also central to the cause. Gods rewarded those who honored them and punished those who did not. Sometimes their choices seem petty and arbitrary to human eyes, but they underscore a worldview where human actions ripple through the divine order. Men prayed and sacrificed not only to win battles but to align themselves with cosmic justice. The gods' whims, when seen as part of a moral economy, make the call to Troy something that tests human virtue as much as physical courage. Each prayer and burnt offering was an attempt to position oneself on the correct side of that economy. Songs and ritual performed at the time of sailing played a role in shaping the ethos of the expedition. Hymns to the gods, recited by priests or shanties sung by oarsmen, transformed fear into shared narrative and made collective action possible. The cadence of repeated phrases mouthed during departure turned private dread into a public drama. In that way, the voyage itself became a performance designed to create unanimity. The poetic shape of these songs is the ancestor of the Homeric formulas that made the memory of Troy more than historical, it became liturgical. Not all who went to Troy did so with noble intent. Among soldiers were those pressed by poverty, indebted to patrons, or compelled by promises of plunder. Their motives complicate the story's moral clarity and show that epic causes are rarely pure. Men went for wives, for vengeance, for loot, sometimes for reasons that would look petty to later moralists. These mixed motives make the call to Troy deeply human. It is a collision of lofty ideals with base desires, and the war becomes a mirror in which a culture examines its highest aspirations and its shoals of small selfishness. The interplay of personal and communal identity during the assembly highlights how varying conceptions of honor could align or conflict. For some heroes, honor was individual glory. For others, it was the longevity of a household or the stability of a city. These different values created tensions within the Greek camp, a place where arguments about distribution of prizes, rights, and leadership were frequent. The conflicts between Agamemnon and Achilles, for example, are not merely quarrels of personality but disputes about what honor should look like. Those quarrels instill the war with internal drama that echoes the initial causes. Memory turns leaders into archetypes over time, and our understanding of the origins is filtered through those enlargements. Agamemnon becomes the imperialist king, Menelaus the betrayed husband, Helen the catalyst and victim, Paris the flawed judge, Odysseus the strategist, Achilles the embodied glory. These archetypes are useful because they distill multifaceted humans into roles that can be held in a single breath, perfect for some epic. Yet beneath those types lie messy biographies and choices that even ancient audiences recognized as complicated. The Homeric heroes are therefore both larger than life and stubbornly individual. The reception of the call to Troy in later Greek thought is revealing as well. Philosophers and playwrights return to the myth again and again, seeking moral exemplars and tragic warnings. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides reworked elements of the legends to probe responsibility, fate, and suffering. The poets treated the origins as a text to be read for human lessons. Their retellings often highlighted the consequences of pride, the fragility of human plans, and the complicated morality of wartime leadership. The call to Troy thus moved from a historical narrative into moral pedagogy, becoming a cautionary tale as much as an origin story. The ancient Greeks did not see myth and history as neatly separated categories the way modern readers often do. Instead, they inhabited a continuum where prodigious acts could be both memory and moral lesson, both fact and fable. The call to arms against Troy could be recalled as a real mobilization of men and resources and appreciated at the same time as a tale that embodied cultural concerns. This dual reading is crucial for listeners today. The story invites us to perceive both what might have happened and what people wanted to have happened, a distinction that informs everything that follows in the Odyssey. Odysseus's departure is the hinge upon which the long story of his wandering turns. He is a man with a mind for tactics and a love for his home. His leaving is not a rupture but a continuation of his role as problem solver. The craft that makes him valuable in council also makes him vulnerable on the waves, for intelligence often invites the choice between duplicity and honesty. His decision to go to Troy therefore begins a personal odyssey that will test every facet of his character. The man who solves puzzles for others must later solve the puzzle of return. One of the poignant ironies of the call to Troy is that it is both a unifying and disintegrating force. It unites disparate Greek communities in a single enterprise and yet disintegrates households, cities, and youth alike in its course. It proves that human solidarity built on honor can be simultaneously creative and destructive. The war's commencement marks a turning point at which scattered grievances assume historical magnitude. Listening to these origins, one hears not only dramatic speeches and the beating of shields, but the softer sounds of culture rearranging itself in response to crisis. Stratagems and speeches at the outset of conflict tell us about leadership styles and political culture. Agamemnon's call to power is imperial and heavy, Nestor's counsel is cautious and elder-wise, Achilles' youth weighs the cost of fame. Leaders talk their way into consensus, often by appealing to narratives about ancestors and gods to frame reasons for joining. The rhetoric used in assembling the expedition reveals how persuasion, authority, and charisma functioned in the ancient world. Such oratorical exchanges are the prehistory of Odysseus's rhetorical prowess, which will be tested again and again in the Odyssey's many conversations. As armies assembled, the moral calculus of sacrifice was unavoidable. Men were asked to put their lives on the line for a cause that could not guarantee they would return to what they had been. Fathers gave sons into ships, mothers blessed men who might never be blessed again, and children watched their households empty. The origin of the epic journey thus carries the sound of much private suffering, which the grand public narrative tends to smooth over. The Odyssey will later return obsessively to those private costs, showing how the consequences of the call to Troy reverberate through families and time. Throughout the narrative of departure, there are echoes of ritualized masculinity and public honor. Heroic culture exalted certain behaviors: rage on the battlefield, generosity to comrades, a capacity for grief, and condemned others, such as shameful cowardice. These social codes explain why individuals risked everything for a reputation rather than for the purely pragmatic aims of survival. The expectations of manhood were themselves a form of social compulsion. To refuse those expectations was to dissent against the community's moral architecture. The call to Troy can therefore be read as the social pressure of a culture crystallizing into action. One cannot understate the role of storytelling itself in driving men to war. Tales of past heroes and ancient victories create a cultural imagination that makes war appear not only possible but desirable. The memory of ancestors who fought and won encourages young men to emulate them, to occupy the same heroic space. The singers in the courts, therefore, do a kind of recruitment. They make war attractive by telling its brightest stories and obfuscating its terrors. That is part of the origin. Mythic memory becomes an engine for new deeds, a feedback loop of glory and loss. The notion of fate in Greek thought is not always fatalistic. It is an awareness of limits and patterns. Men could act, and their choices mattered, but they acted in a field where certain outcomes were more likely than others. Prophecy, divine will, and human ambition braided together to create the conditions for the war. The hero's acceptance of these probabilities shaped the ethos of courage. Courage is action in the presence of understanding, not ignorance. The Odyssey will later show how this understanding can make homecoming both possible and fraught. Long before the wooden horse and Achilles' wrath, the call to Troy was a test of narrative power, the idea that a story could transform a private quarrel into a war remembered for millennia. It asks listeners to reflect on the processes by which we make meaning out of conflict, how we assign blame, praise, and narrative shape. The Greeks told themselves that honor required action, and in telling they summoned the action into being. The Odyssey is the aftermath of that summoning, a tale about what returns from a story when the story's actors themselves try to return to ordinary life. The material culture of the Bronze Age gives texture to these abstract forces. Bronze weapons, carved ivory, and palatial frescoes tell us that the world that birthed the Trojan legend was complex and materially rich. The trade that passed through Troy and into the Hittite sphere provided wealth and motive. The palaces of Mycenae were centers of redistribution, which meant securing them or contesting them had real economic implications. These are the concrete stakes behind the poetic proclamations of honor, the real reasons men who listened to bards would also listen to their wallet. The human cost of the war was not confined to the battlefield. Disease, famine, and the displacement of populations followed in the wake of a long siege. Such social dislocation becomes the soil in which the Odyssey grows, a world with many missing fathers, widowed mothers, and young heirs guarding uncertain inheritances. The story of Odysseus's return gains its moral complexity from knowing that many never returned, and that those who did were changed beyond recognition. The call to Troy, therefore, is an inciting incident for a civilization reevaluating the meaning of survival and continuity. Over centuries the story evolved, but its opening moment, the call to Troy, remains compelling because it condenses human experience into a single, forceful choice. It reveals how desire, politics, divine caprice, and social obligation entwine to create events no single person could have predicted but everyone felt compelled to join. The Odyssey's long journey is the aftershock of that first call, a narrative that examines how to return after obligation has been paid in full and then some. The epic invites us to consider how beginnings make endings inevitable, and how endings transform our understanding of what began them. Finally, the call to Troy is an invitation to listen to the complexities of cause. It is an old song, sure, but it is also an argument about agency, culpability, and the ways communities hold themselves together. The heroes who answer the call are not simply brave archetypes, they are people making decisions inside a dense web of relationships and narratives. As you drive or work and hear this tale unfold, imagine the salted wind, the creak of ships, the hush of prayers, and the bright flash of bronze under sun. Know that every beginning is a small confession of what we value, and the Trojan summons was a confession that changed the world. And so the call to Troy remains an origin story for the Odyssey because it asks what a man must sacrifice to be remembered, what a city must lose to be secured, and what a culture will tell itself to justify the costs. It moves from a golden apple on a wedding table to 1,000 ships on the sea, from a personal judgment to a civilization's mobilization. The journey that follows is as much inward as it is outward, a return to the self after the self has been transformed by public narrative. The story we inherit thus begins with a choice that was never simply one man's to make, and it teaches us how the smallest incidents can grow until they claim whole peoples and reshape memory itself. The wine-dark sea is not a color so much as a mood, a way of tasting the world when the sun hangs low and the horizon is a promise and a threat at once. When the ancients said wine-dark, they named that uneasy burn in the throat of evening, the deep bruise under the forearm of a storm cloud. To hear the story of Odysseus is, in part, to learn that the sea itself can be character and trial, an actor with moods and grudges and favors to lend or withhold. The long voyage home becomes a succession of encounters in which the water around the ship changes its voice, and with that voice come monsters and marvels who test not only skill and strength but cunning, loyalty, and the stubbornness of love for a single house on a small island. If you close your eyes and imagine the crew around Odysseus, you should try to hear different kinds of oars, the hollow cluck of a single blade leaving the water, the slap it makes as it returns. There is a rhythm to keeping a crew going that is as much about stories and food and music as it is about seamanship, and Homer's tale lingers on these small economies of sound and comfort. The men are sailors and also a chorus, keeping time with work songs and worrying together, half-born plans and confessions muffled in the dark below decks. When sky and sea grow indistinguishable, the human voice becomes the anchor of civilization on a craft that could otherwise be just a plank and sail drifting toward myth. Odysseus, who will always be called wily, is first of all a man who knows how to listen, to omens, to weather, to the murmurs of discontent among his men. Cunning in Homeric terms is not merely trickery, it is the capacity to translate changeable circumstances into an advantage without losing the thread of what matters. He can plot a course by stars and stories, by the hush that comes before a storm and the way a gull circles when fish are near, but he must also navigate moods, the mutter of hunger, the sudden defiance of men who have been rowing too long, the witch's flattery when it tastes like honey. These are the human tides that move beneath the visible swells, and in the Odyssey they are as dangerous as any physical whirlpool. Before the famous monsters appear, the voyage is busy with the familiar cruelties of war returning to peace, raids, spoiled spoils, and the habit of taking what must be taken. One of the earliest episodes after Troy shows Odysseus and his crew pressed by necessity to raid the Sirens, a coastal tribe with a sure mastery of the land. They sack the town and feast and sleep, and in the indulgence of victory they forget the discipline of the voyage. The Sirens gather strength and strike back at dawn. The lesson is immediate and familiar. Victory is a fever, and the sea demands steadier measures than triumphant revelries on foreign soil. From reckless taste of plunder to the more soporific danger of lotus eaters is a quick shift in tone but not in menace. The lotus eaters are not swords or rocks, they sell forgetfulness, a plant whose sweetness dissolves desire for anything but another handful of leaves. Men who sample it lose the memory of home, the hunger for it, and the urgency that makes a sailor row through storms and starless nights. To be desired is to be dead in the Odyssey, and Odysseus must drag his men back to the ship, literal bodies pulled like kelp from an abiding tide of complacency. A painful act that is also an early proof of leadership, to take away comfort in order to preserve the future. Then the sea turns a face that is physical and grotesque when they meet the Cyclops, the son of Poseidon, whose single eye has become a symbol for a kind of barbarous isolation. Polyphemus lives in a cave where law exists beside appetite, not above it, and he sees strangers only as meat or coin. When Odysseus and his men are trapped, the encounter becomes a study in contrasts, brute force confronting the subtler art of trickery, the shelter of a cave offering prison and feast alike. Odysseus's answer, first to wind the Cyclops, then to blind him with a heated stake while he sleeps, reads like both a clever stratagem and a moral compromise, a necessary cruelty in a world that will eat you if you do not act. What follows the blinding is as important as the blinding itself because it reveals the cost of even the most brilliant trick. Odysseus cannot resist boasting after they escape. He calls to the rock and reveals his name to the Cyclops he has wounded. This is not mere vanity, though it is that too. It is the heroic need to be remembered, to have one's story told and sung. Yet Homer's narrative shows that naming your victory invites the gods' notice, and when Polyphemus prays to his father Poseidon, the sea god becomes an antagonist whose revenge will shape the remaining years of the voyage. The sea itself is, thus, personalized and politicized, and the whole crew is pulled into a feud not of their making. Between these grand episodes are the quieter mariners, their daily routines made strange by the constant possibility of disaster. The food they eat, the way they mix their wine, the rituals before leaving, libations poured into the salt, prayers to the gods, are the scaffolding on which fate hangs. Even the simple act of anchoring becomes a ritual, the rope thrown, the fluke dug in, a small liturgy to postpone catastrophe. These ordinary actions serve as a counterpoint to the monstrous encounters, reminding the listener that great stories are built from innumerable small decisions, each with its own tiny gravity. When Odysseus reaches the island of Aeolus, master of winds, the narrative gives us a mythic map of meteorology and psychology. Aeolus is both hospitable and prophetic, a giver of gifts who recognizes that the elements can be ordered by human cunning as well as by divine will. He bundles the adverse winds into a skin and places them under Odysseus's charge, a tangible solution to an invisible problem. But the prison of order cannot survive human impatience. The crew, suspecting treasure, open the bag at night and the stored winds rush out. In an instant, the sea remembers its wildness and hurls the ship back to Aeolus's doors, where even the benevolent keeper refuses further aid, for human folly cannot be endlessly remedied by divine kindness. A sudden shift to wreck brings the Laestrygonians into view, gargantuan spearmen who, from the cliffs, hurl boulders that crush whole ships. Their violence is elemental in its physicality. They are not so much monsters as forces of nature disguised in human scales. The ships are not lured so much as annihilated, and Odysseus loses nearly all his fleet in a single, devastating day. That loss reframes the voyage. Out of many vessels emerges a singular tale of one ship and its captain, a narrowing that intensifies personal responsibility and the pressure on Odysseus's intellect and stealth. Circe's island, Aeaea, then presents a more seductive danger, a shape-shifting threat that requires not only wiles but also patience and reciprocity. Circe turns men into swine with a cup and a song, a metamorphosis that feels like a punishment for greed and lack of restraint. Odysseus resists by way of Hermes' gift, an herb to counteract enchantment, and then negotiates, staying with Circe for a year as if to learn other kinds of living and to correct his own breaks on pleasure. His men are restored, but the episode asks whether time spent in comfort is a trap or a reconstitution, and Odysseus departs both wiser and slower, aware now of how easily a home might be mistaken for a harbor of illusions. The descent to the land of the dead is one of the most sustained meditations in the epic on memory and loss. Odysseus digs a trench, pours libations, and calls up shades to ask questions about the future, about the house he left behind, about the fate of friends and foes. Here the sea functions oddly as conduit rather than barrier. It is the route by which a living man converses with those who have passed beyond it. The shades, especially the seer Tiresias, offer warnings that are precise and grim, and Odysseus listens, because in any voyage the best map is that which includes the dead. In this visit, the ocean's role as boundary is reframed. It is not only a physical span to cross, but a thin membrane between known and unknown lives. After returning from the underworld, Odysseus must face the sirens, whose song is a different kind of peril, an assault on the mind that promises knowledge and delights to those who will risk everything to hear. The image of men lashed to the mast, ears plugged with beeswax, creates a tableau of self-command that is almost monastic in its asceticism. Odysseus asks to be bound so he can hear and survive, an act that combines curiosity with humility. He knows he must yield his liberty for a short time in order to be present to something irresistible. It is, in a way, a moral about limits. Some seductions you can be near, others you must not be allowed to serve, and some pleasures require an attendant who holds back the hand that would reach too far. Immediately adjacent lie Scylla and Charybdis, two dangers paired like opposing teeth in a trap of geography and fate. Scylla snatches sailors with her multiple heads from a cliff, each bite a scalpel that carves away the crew, while Charybdis draws down whole chests of water into a devouring whirlpool, vomiting them back out broken. The choice is framed as an impossible calculus: steer closer to Charybdis and risk total annihilation, pass near Scylla and accept the loss of select men to save the ship. Odysseus chooses the latter, sacrificing a portion to keep the majority alive, and Homer asks the listener to consider the moral weight of such decisions, the way leaders must sometimes choose lesser tragedies when the alternative is oblivion. The slaughter of Helios cattle is a human failure that is also cosmic in its consequences. Odysseus, having been faithful and cautious, is temporarily separated from his men, and the hunger of the crew, combined with their need to assert agency, leads them to disobey explicit prophecy. The very act of eating sacred cattle is mythic sacrilege. It undoes the fragile trust between man and God, and in turn, brings down a storm of retribution. Zeus, who keeps balance, obliges with a bolt that shatters the ship and kills everyone but Odysseus, who survives by clinging to a raft. It is a purge that leaves the hero alone, alive, and raw with the knowledge that the sea will now demand a long voyage in solitude. Alone, Odysseus washes up on the island of Calypso, who keeps him for years with a love that is itself a form of imprisonment. Calypso's affection is offered as a temptation that is both warm and immobilizing. She can give him comfort, immortality even, if he will simply stay. Yet Odysseus's heart remains tethered to Ithaca and Penelope, and his yearning for home eclipses the allure of permanent ease. Hermes' arrival, carrying Zeus's command that Calypso must release him, reframes liberty as a right even gods must respect. The sea, once again, is the route of homecoming, but it will be a road long in time and lined with further marvels and cruelties. The Phaeacians who finally carry Odysseus to Ithaca deserve their own attention as civilizers of the sea. They are exemplary hosts who represent an ordered, generous maritime polity whose ships are swift and whose manners are impeccable. Their offering of passage across the wine-dark sea is not merely commercial, it is a final reconciliation between the world of wandering and the world of domesticity. In listening to Odysseus's story, they act as a cultural mirror, reflecting back the hero's deeds and granting him the means to complete the narrative arc by enabling his final return. Embedded in each episode is a lesson about storytelling itself. Odysseus must tell and retell his voyages, partly to account for himself and partly to shape the way the world will remember him. The telling is a way to shape identity. For Odysseus, narrative is a form of survival. When he lies to strangers, he does so for survival, and when he reveals truths, he does so for vindication, and sometimes both impulses operate at once. The listener on the road, the singer in the hall, and the reader in the dark are all involved in a pact with this story. To hear is to share in the remembering that preserves a life beyond mortal span. We should linger over the idea of monsters as both literal creatures and metaphors of human condition. Scylla and Charybdis are not merely beasts, they are the names we give to unavoidable loss and to the whirlpools of bad luck. Circe's transformations enact the shame or reclamation we undergo when we lose ourselves in excess. The Cyclops embodies the otherness of a culture without reciprocal hospitality, and the sirens the temptation of knowledge stripped of obligation. The sea, in hosting these figures, becomes a testing ground where human values and vulnerabilities are displayed in their starkest forms. This long catalog of threats also highlights something about ancient navigation and ancient cosmology. Mariners then read the stars as we might read an instrument panel, but their instruments were gods and omens and the weather's tone. To cross the wine-dark sea was to practice an applied spirituality. Prayers and offerings were tools as necessary as oars, and the favor of Athena or the anger of Poseidon could be as determinative as wind. The gods acted like windsmen, pulling strings invisible to mortals, but the sailors had learned to embed countermeasures, rituals, prudence, cunning strategies into every stretch of their practice. The motif of home, or nostos, is the spine of the epic and frames every encounter as a test of whether the voyager will be permitted to return. Nostos is not just physical arrival, it is social and moral reintegration, the slow and often painful reclamation of a place in a web of relationships. Odysseus's many wanderings are thus evaluations of loyalty and identity. Will he still be Penelope's husband, Telemachus's father, the rightful ruler of Ithaca when he returns? Every monster, every enchantment, is calibrated to threaten one of these ties and thereby to measure the durability of home in his heart. When we examine the psychology of Odysseus's men, we find a mixture of heroism, weakness, fatigue, and the simple animal hunger that undercuts plans. They are not a Greek chorus of types so much as fully human figures whose private and public acts shape fates. Their mutinies and panics are as instructive as their acts of courage. Homer gives them weight because the loss of a companion in the waves is an ethical wound to the leader who could not keep them safe. Their deaths, especially in episodes like Scylla's ravaging or the destruction after the cattle of the sun, are mourned not with rhetoric but with the stark grief of practical loss, fewer hands at the oars, empty places at the meal. The wine-dark sea, moreover, is a topography of time. Days marked by alternating light and dark give rise to a psychological time different from the modern clock-bound day. Seasons are read in wind shifts, star positions, and animal migrations. Time is a weather pattern. Odysseus's wanderings are stretched across years, and with each season the meaning of waiting and longing accrues new layers. Penelope weaving and unweaving her shroud, the slow grinding of suitors in Ithaca, these domestic measures of time mirror the ocean's slow erosions and swift surges. We cannot fail to notice the role of women in the narrative beyond Calypso and Circe. Penelope, faithful and cunning in her own right, creates obstacles for the suitors with a loom and a ruse, a domestic theater that is as strategic as any battle. Her everyday craftwork is, in the epic's moral economy, a kind of resistance, an expression of sovereignty maintained by intelligence and patience. Similarly, the maidservants and queens of other houses operate within constraints but exercise power in subtler forms, teaching that maritime heroics and household politics are braided together in the epic's moral fabric. Even minor episodes, an encounter with a stranger, a shared meal, a boast told in the wrong place, have consequences that ripple outward. Hospitality, or xenia, is the code by which humans negotiate the dangerous expanses of the world. When hospitality is honored, a guest is protected. When it is violated, calamity is often not far behind. The Cyclops, for instance, violates the ritual of xenia by eating guests, and the horror of that crime justifies the heroic response while simultaneously summoning the wrath of a god who has family ties with the Cyclops. The language of machines and craft in the poem, oars, rudders, carpentry of the ship, is married to the language of bodies. A ship in Homer is almost an organism, the hull abreast, the mast a spine. Sailors refer to the ship with affection and steadiness as if it were a companion, and shipbuilding itself is an art that plants human industry into the chaos of the sea. Craftsmen who build the boat are, in effect, theologians and physicians, combining wood, rope, and human labor in the service of survival and story. Moving beyond the immediate episodes, consider the Odyssey's influence on later seafaring imaginations. Mariners over centuries have recognized themselves in Odysseus and his crew, the long separation from home, the capricious elements, the threat of strange shores. The epic supplied metaphors and methods. Be wary of the land's sweetness, never underestimate the cost of indulgence, adopt rituals to make hazardous crossings less arbitrary. Sailors' chants and rituals on later coasts often carried echoes of Homeric litanies, and the poem's map of perils became, in a way, an atlas of human foibles. The interplay between fate and decision saturates the story. The gods may shape circumstances. Poseidon's grudge is a storm that never fully sleeps, but the choices of men determine how these circumstances will be met. Odysseus demonstrates that intelligence without virtue is dangerous and that virtue without intelligence will be crushed. Each monster forces a moral calculus, to lie or to tell the truth, to remain or to flee, to sacrifice a few to save many. These are not mere dilemmas for drama, they are the marrow of leadership, and the Odyssey invites listeners to judge decisions in a context where complete good cannot be achieved. The epic sensory detail keeps the listener grounded in the physicality of the sea. The taste of brine on the lips, the sting of spray, the ache in the shoulders from endless rowing, these are the textures of Homer's maritime world. Even in scenes of supernatural horror, Homer returns the reader to the concrete, a man's hand gripping the oar, the slackening of a rope, the dull thud when a boat hits rock. Such specificity makes the mariner's experiences credible as more than allegory. They become events that could be lived, remembered, and transmitted as survival knowledge. Beyond the many perils, the Odyssey also offers spectacles of wonder that are not necessarily dangerous but are uncanny, islands where sheep have purple fleeces or where the inhabitants practice strange laws, harbors that glow with phosphorescence, trees that whisper like old friends. These marvels complicate the moral geometry by offering beauty unconnected to immediate threat. They remind the listener that the wine-dark sea is not merely a conveyor of doom, it is also a bearer of astonishment, a corridor of revelations that can feed the imagination and sustain the heart on long nights of road labor. The theme of identity and disguise recurs in maritime context. Sailors and gods change forms, masks are worn as readily as cloaks, and a captain's face may be concealed by weather or by narrative pretense. Odysseus himself practices disguise as a method of testing his home and his family, returning to Ithaca first as a beggar to observe. This kind of camouflage is a double-edged skill. It allows truth to be confirmed but also delays reunion and can harden a leader's heart to cruelty if applied too long. The sea, with its shifting mists and darkness, naturally facilitates and encourages such mutable presentations. Homer's portrayal of animals in maritime settings is equally deliberate. The gull that cries overhead signals shoals of fish and, therefore, a chance at quick sustenance. Dolphins that play around the ship might be interpreted as omens of favor, and whales and sea serpents get mythic gravitas reflecting the awe felt before creatures larger than human scale. The presence or absence of these animals often functions as narrative shorthand, a blessing or a warning that will shape the immediate course of action, and listeners attuned to such signs are offered glimpses into the seafaring psychology of the age. We should pause on the motif of sleep and wakefulness because it is central to many disasters. Sleep is the thin line between safety and disaster. The Cyclops eats men while they are inert, the crew falls asleep and eats Helios's cattle, and storms find men unprepared when they surrender to drowsiness. Vigilance is a spiritual discipline in the Odyssey as much as it is a practical requirement. Conversely, the hero's own moments of sleep, when he sleeps with Calypso, when he naps under the table of a guest house, generate vulnerability and also humanize a hero often seen as a paragon of cunning. Consider also the political subtext in episodes framed around host-guest relations and sovereignty. Odysseus's return to Ithaca is not merely emotional, it is juridical. He must reclaim a kingship eroded by suitors who have turned law into personal excess. Every monster he has faced overseas functions as a rehearsal of the political battles to come at home, the discipline of crew that prepares him for the discipline of a palace, the cunning needed against a Cyclops that prepares him for trickery among men. The sea, in this sense, is a training ground for governance. Music and poetry are constant companions on the wine-dark sea. Songs launched from throats under sail are both diversion and spiritual armor. They help men remember who they are and where they have been. When Odysseus sits among strangers and composes tales of his own prowess, the act of storytelling itself is a kind of trade wind, propelling his reputation and ensuring his deeds survive beyond his lifespan. Bards in the poem function as both historians and moralists, shaping memory in ways that matter as much as tactical cunning. The moral complexity of Odysseus keeps revealing new folds the more one dwells on it. He is at once a devoted husband, a visionary leader, a liar when necessary, an egoist when it suits him, and a man capable of great tenderness and great cruelty. The sea magnifies these contradictions because it strips away the extraneous and exposes core dispositions under pressure. Early in the poem he can be merciful and cunning, later he can be vengeful and ruthless. Homer does not let him stand as a one-dimensional hero. Instead, he is a human capital of virtues and vices, tested on every wave. The interplay of memory and forgetting spans much of what happens on the wine-dark sea. The Lotus Eaters represent literal amnesia, while other episodes show the gradual erosion of memory that long voyages produce. Faces blend, stories blur, loyalties fray. Odysseus's insistence on telling his own tale is therefore also an act of memorial preservation, a way to fix facts in the making of legend. The sea encourages forgetting and the hero must constantly combat it, not only to keep the past alive but to preserve the ethical arc required to reach home. Homer's geography, though mythic, is also surprisingly pragmatic. Places like the island of the Phaeacians or the harbor of the Laestrygonians correspond to coastal forms sailors might well have known, caves with mouths opening to the surf, reefs that break ships, coves that hide predators. In this respect, the Odyssey functions partly as a sailor's manual in the guise of a poem, teaching by allegory about how to treat strangers, when to be suspicious of sweetness, and how to measure risk by the shape of the land and the temper of the wind. The sea's metaphoric role as a testing ground extends into rites of passage. Young men who leave home and return different are the essential human story told aboard these oar-planked vessels. The voyage strips away adolescent certainty and creates a tempered adult, but it also sometimes corrupts. Not every return is triumphant. The epic shows that return itself is an art. One must arrive with the right mixture of humility and assertion, revealing oneself at the right moment to enact justice and reconciliation. The role of providence and coincidence surfaces in many scenes where luck changes the course of events. A chance island might offer a god who takes pity, or a favorable wind might appear right when hope seems lost. Homer does not reduce everything to divine fiat. Luck and human action are braided. A sailor's skill increases the probability of survival, but luck can reverse expectations in a single gust. The sea is a machine of probabilities, and the hero's job is to act so that random chance can work to his advantage. Odysseus's relationships with gods are particularly nuanced. Athena is a patroness and hypocritical in her partiality, giving gifts of disguise and counsel as politics requires. Poseidon's wrath behaves like a family vendetta, personal and endless. Zeus remains the arbiter of balance and often slides between indifference and the enforcement of cosmic justice. These divine relationships are less straightforward worship than complicated diplomacy, a system of favors and debts that Odysseus must navigate as expertly as any rocky passage. If one listens carefully to Homer's cadences, one will hear a poetic voice that moves between exuberant detail and stark economy, and it is this rhythm that suits the sea's own alternations. There are moments in the epic where sentences bend like the hull under a heavy swell and then snap back into precise observation. This literary craft reproduces on the ear the experience of voyaging, the way a long day of rowing accumulates into one night's terror or surprise. The poem's form thus models the sea's caprices, a steady lyricism punctuated by jolts and sudden shifts. The story of the Odyssey in later ages becomes a repository of archetypes, Odysseus as the cunning wanderer, the sea as a realm of testing, monsters as moral puzzles. Artists and philosophers have used these archetypes to think about exile, memory, and the formation of self. The poem's episodes have been retold to ask what home is, whether identity is fixed, and how communities reintegrate the traveler. In these retellings, the wine-dark sea becomes a mirror in which subsequent ages have seen their fears and hopes reflected. Maritime technology in the poem, oars, sails, navigation by stars, also has ethical dimensions. A polished hull and a skilled helmsman could mean the difference between life and death, and those who command ships are entrusted with the lives of many. Odysseus treats his craft with the solemnity of a sacred object, knowing that skill alone will not save him but that it is an essential ally. In this way, the poem makes a case for competence as a virtue. Skill kept in service to home and family is revered, skill deployed to selfish ends is denounced. The long durations of the trial, the years Odysseus spends wandering, invite reflection about endurance as moral training. The attrition of isolation, the slow grief of missed milestones, the erosion of youthful certainties are all part of maturation. The wine-dark sea thus functions like an apprenticeship, making demands of patience, humility, and the capacity to adapt to a world that does not privilege intentions. To reach Ithaca intact is to have internalized many small lessons about the nature of fate and responsibility. The narrative's attention to food and hunger is less culinary than symbolic. Meals are social contracts, and the act of sharing food often symbolizes hospitality, alliance, and trust. Conversely, raiding and consuming the livestock of guests is a transgression that dissolves social bonds and summons divine vengeance. Food is therefore a currency of civilization. To respect it is to respect law, and to violate it is to invite the sea's harsh accounting. Consider also the motif of sight and blindness threaded through the episodes. Polyphemus's one eye and subsequent blindness becomes a meditation on perception. To see without understanding is as dangerous as being blind. Odysseus's disguised returns require others to be blind to his identity to achieve full revelation. Vision, in this mythic economy, is not merely a physical faculty but a moral condition. Those who truly see the world must also interpret it well, and those who fail to do so are often the victims of their own narrow perspectives. The sea's noises, the creak of timbers, the moan of wind through rigging, the monstrous calls, are a constant soundtrack that Homer renders with a poet's ear. These sounds are not only atmospheric but also informative. They tell sailors when a storm is approaching, when whales break the surface, or when a sandbar drags the keel. The poem teaches the listener in attentive listening the value of auditory detail in a life lived mostly at the edge of darkness and illumination. We should not forget the role of ritual in calming or invoking elements. Libations poured to the gods, prayers offered before setting out, and sacrifices performed at critical junctures thread the narrative with religious practice. These rituals are a form of risk management and an attempt to create predictability in a fundamentally unpredictable environment. They also reinforce social cohesion. When everyone participates in a rite, the group renews its shared identity against the threat of dispersal. The motif of cunning versus force recurs as a theme of political philosophy. Odysseus's triumphs are often mental rather than physical, making him the archetype of the politician who wins by persuasion and guile. Yet the Odyssey refuses to valorize trickery unqualified. Cunning detached from ethical purpose ends in ruin or exile. The poem suggests a balance. Craft must be disciplined by loyalties and anchored to a homeward telos. The finale of the journey, the return to Ithaca, reunites sea and land in a dramatic collision of histories. The homecoming is not seamless. Penelope tests Odysseus, suitors are punished, mercy and vengeance clash in a hall full of men who have forgotten the old laws. The sea has taught Odysseus lessons about limit and loss, and now those lessons are applied at home in a moral adjudication that demands judgment as much as reconciliation. This final application teaches that voyages do not end with arrival, they continue in the work of reconstructing a social order that has been frayed by absence. Finally, the Odyssey's lasting power lies in its capacity to hold ambivalence. It celebrates cunning and laments violence. It honors loyalty and narrates betrayal. It endorses pious ritual while exposing gods who play favorites. The wine-dark sea is a landscape of paradoxes, terrifying and beautiful, destructive and life-giving, reflecting human life in its complexity. To listen to Odysseus's story, especially the trials on that sea, is to accept that the voyage home is never only a straight line but an extended education in the art of being mortal, resourceful, and ultimately, profoundly human. The Odyssey begins not with a man but with a storm, and that storm is the handwriting of gods. From the very opening, the lives of mortals are shaped by powers that listen and strike, reward and relent. As we listen to the slow recitation of A Sailor Returned, we also listen to the complaints of divinities who do not forget names, crimes, or slights. The wrath of the gods in Homeric thought is never arbitrary lightning in an empty sky. It is born of relationships and grievances, of honor wounded and promises unkept. When a deity rouses, it is because some balance has shifted, because Xenia was broken, because fate tightens its knot around a life already entangled with responsibility. Consider Poseidon, the sea's great lord, who carries a grudge like a sailor carries a chart. He is not angry because he is capricious, but because Odysseus has pushed back at a cosmic rule by blinding his son. In Homeric logic, this is not just an act of violence, it is an affront to a divine kinship that must be answered by storms and shipwrecks. Athena, in contrast, carries her wrath differently. She teaches, she guides, and she manipulates time and disguise with purposeful patience. She loves Odysseus as a representative of cunning and brilliance, and her pleasure is at once personal and political. When she intercedes, it is often to rebalance the scales that Poseidon tips, to restore the narrative to a moral axis where cleverness and loyalty are rewarded. Zeus sits above these rivalries like a judge who keeps a ledger of human fate and divine limits. His thunderbolts are not mere tools of destruction, they are pronouncements of cosmic order. When Zeus speaks through lightning or sends a calm across the ocean, the tenor of the story turns because his will is the breath that can both whip the sea into fury and lull it into sleep. The gods test mortals through tempests and trials as much as through whispers of inspiration. Their tests are dramatic. They are storms at sea but also moral dilemmas on strange shores. Each island Odysseus reaches is like a courtroom in which he must stand, plead, and sometimes cheat his way to mercy while never entirely stepping outside what is humanly possible. Divine wrath often arrives in layers. The first is misfortune that might be weather, the second is social consequence, and the third is moral reckoning. A storm may scatter a crew, but the loss lingers in sorrow at home and in the erosion of reputation. Tellingly, the gods almost always use the sea as their medium because the ocean is the liminal space where men are least powerful and most vulnerable. Aeolus, keeper of the winds, teaches one of the most poignant lessons about divine testing. He bundles storms like gifts and, by doing so, shows that control over nature is not simply possession but stewardship. When Odysseus' men betray that trust and open the bag that contains the winds, the consequence, itself a tempest released, stands as an emblem of human curiosity and the fragile boundary between divine favor and disaster. On the island of the Lotus Eaters, the test is not weather but forgetfulness. A plant offers oblivion and a quiet life, a subtle divine indulgence that would erase the longing that drives Odysseus. The temptation is a different kind of storm. It is the slow, sweet erasure of desire, a test of whether men can remember who they are and what they must do. The Cyclops episode alters the thematic map of the Odyssey because it binds human violence to cosmic reprisal. Polyphemus is monstrous and brutal, yet in blinding him Odysseus commits an offense to the family of gods. The creature is a son of Poseidon, and so the crime echoes beyond the cave. That act of hubris is a flashpoint where cunning becomes provocation, and the sea answers in a long, patient retaliation. Divine wrath is not only punishment but education. It carves character out of suffering. Odysseus learns craft beyond cunning, endurance beyond hope, and patience beyond rage because gods force him into long nights of suffering. Pain becomes a tutor in this epic, shaping the contours of a hero who will return changed. The suitors in Ithaca offer a study in how divine will finds human instruments to execute justice. Their sacrilegious dining and egregious violations of hospitality prompt Athena's calculated wrath. She permits a slow accumulation of signs, omens, and favors that allow Odysseus to strike with moral clarity, showing that the gods prefer a structured, almost theatrical justice to chaotic vengeance. Calypso's island seems to be a refuge yet is a divine test of a different hue. Loyalty is measured not by absence of comfort but by the endurance of yearning. Odysseus enjoys a semi-divine life, yet his heart remains on Ithaca because desire for home is as strong as any hunger for immortality. The gods watch silently until pity interferes, for even divinity can feel the pull of human fidelity. Aeschylus would say that gods are instruments of fate, but Homer shows them as agents with wills of their own. They intercede based on narratives of honor where human actors also make choices that matter. This interplay creates a layered landscape in which storms are not merely natural events but speeches, arguments, and verdicts conveyed through water and wind. Omens and sacrifices thread through the narrative as warnings and approvals, a kind of language between men and gods. When birds make a sudden cry or the sky flashes, that is not mere noise but a sentence to be interpreted. Priests and prophets serve as translators and sometimes as manipulators of those sentences, which means divine wrath can be anticipated, mitigated, or invoked depending on human skill. The shipwrecks and tempests that dot the Odyssey are like punctuation marks, halting and defining movement as much as destroying it. Each storm forces a pause, an enforced reflection, a remapping of intentions. The sea, once tamed by man in the design of a good ship, becomes again an instrument of lessons when gods decide to teach. Scylla and Charybdis speak to the cruelty of divine geometry. They are not gods in the conventional sense, but monstrous instruments of fate that Odysseus must navigate. Choosing between the two is a type of moral logic in miniature where one chooses the lesser evil, and the gods watch with a detached interest as human calculus comes to guided blood. The scene underscores that wrath can be structural, embedded in the contours of geography and the mythic imagination. The Siren's Song is another divine test that appeals to mind more than body, a temptation to knowledge and forgetfulness in equal measure. Odysseus, curious and prideful, chooses to hear and binds himself to the mast while his crew plugs their ears, turning the ordeal into a demonstration of both human curiosity and self-control. Their passage past the sirens reveals that survival is often an exercise in strategy, a dance with divinity that requires both humility and cleverness. Helios' cattle and the taboo against slaughtering them show how the gods can weaponize famine into moral certainty. Even when hunger gnaws and desperation grows, violating a god's property becomes an existential error. The slaughter of cattle is punished not with immediate thunderbolts but with a slow, inexorable ruin that culminates in a storm at sea and the obliteration of men, showing that divine wrath can be patient and bureaucratic. The Phaeacians offer a model of divine hospitality that in itself evokes the gods' approval and eventual reproof. Their quick assistance to cast Odysseus home pleases Athena but draws Zeus' scrutiny because the mortal support of divine errands is not to be taken lightly. Through their generous actions, the Phaeacians become unwitting actors in a divine drama that requires them to pay a price in the end, illustrating that mortal kindness can also incur divine attention. Homer often uses personified concepts to make divine trials feel intimate, where dawn, sleep, and death behave as neighbors rather than abstractions. These personifications make the gods' moods approachable. They explain the sudden calm, the deep slumber, the final cessation as familial gestures of cosmic beings. It is a literary device that turns the universe into a place where moods and favors govern reality. The role of Hermes is quietly essential. He is the messenger and the negotiator who softens divine strictures when prudence demands it. He persuades Calypso to release Odysseus, and he offers magical help to mortal allies, reducing a god's wrath by translating petition into action. Hermes acts as both cause and cure, an intermediary who shows that divine wrath can be mediated through deft diplomacy. Divine wrath and human sin are often mirror images. When kings behave unjustly, when wards of hospitality are violated, the gods respond by creating storms that dislodge centers of power. The suitors, for instance, are less victims of natural fate than victims of a moral order that demands retribution. Their death is the restoration of both household order and cosmic law. Odysseus himself becomes an agent of divine justice when he returns home. He does not act alone but with Athena's shaping hand and Zeus' distant sanction. His slaughter of the suitors is brutal, but the narrative frames it as a necessary purge demanded by a higher order. That framing complicates modern responses because it insists that wrathful acts can be righteous when grounded in ancient concepts of justice. Even the gods are tested by their own promises and jealousies. Athena's favoritism puts her in a position where she must defend her choice against Poseidon's resentment. Their interactions suggest that divine temperance is not a given but a choice, and that mercy can be as political as wrath. The argument between divinities resembles a courtroom where rhetoric and precedent determine the form of punishment. The insistence on memory and story in the epic functions as another axis along which divine wrath operates. Gods demand that names be remembered and tales told accurately, for reputation is a kind of immortality mortals crave. When accounts are altered or praise withheld, the gods may respond because the narratives that sustain their own relevance are threatened. Dreams in Homer are conduits of divine will and sometimes of caprice. They deliver commands, promises, and sometimes deceit, as when a god sends a false dream to test resolve. Odysseus receives prophetic visions that are half guidance, half trial, and interpreting them becomes a skill as vital as seamanship. The moral of many such dreams is not only to warn but to subject the mind to uncertainty, making clarity itself a prize the gods may grant or withhold. The Trojan War itself is the ancestral shame whose reverberations force gods to re-examine their alliances. Divine support and anger during the war set the stage for later retributions, and the gods who took sides are obliged to maintain their loyalty or suffer consequences of their own. Thus the wrath that shapes Odysseus' wanderings is partly the echo of earlier judgments made among immortals. Religious rituals in the Odyssey are not ornamental, they are the language by which mortals seek to appease and the method by which gods measure sincerity. Sacrifices matter because they reveal intention, and the gods can smell deceit or indifference in the smoke rising from altars. Proper ritual performance secures favor, while violation invites storms, showing how civic religion and personal fate are braided together. Prophecy functions as both solace and snare because knowing the future does not always change the present. Prophets like Tiresias can reveal outcomes but cannot always command how a man will face them. What the gods offer in prophecy is a map of inevitabilities that still requires moral navigation, which can infuriate either party when expectations and behavior collide. In Ithaca, Penelope's tests of suitors and of her husband become miniature enactments of divine trials on the human scale. Her weaving trick and her demand for proof of identity are tests that parallel the gods' trials, measuring patience, fidelity, and intelligence. Her endurance is a testament to mortal resolve under the strain of surly suitors and a world organized by divine expectation. Divine wrath is also a force that checks human pride, arrogance before the gods, or an ignorance of sacred laws prompts storms that strip away illusions. Odysseus, famous for his cleverness, must learn humility when tricks lead to cost. Pride and craft are double-edged. They win battles but also invite the scrutiny of powers who will eventually balance any ledger that grows too full. The motif of recognition, anagnorisis, recurs as a mechanism for the gods to reveal their judgments. When a disguised Odysseus is finally recognized by Argos, by Euryclea, and by Penelope, it is as if cosmic truth emerges from fog. Recognition is not just a human relief, but a divine nod that the time for punishment or pardon has matured. Divine wrath also manifests through the natural world, where animals and landscapes bear the signs of a god's mood. A calm sea might indicate Zeus' favor while a stubborn wind marks Poseidon's continuing ire. Forests, rivers, and fields participate in the narrative as the gods' visible moods, so that traveling through a place becomes a way of reading the divine disposition. There is an ethical tension in the poem about whether the gods' punishments are just, and Homer invites us to weigh the morality of divine wrath. The gods are often anthropomorphic in their anger and fondness, and their punishments are sometimes disproportionate. Yet the poem also insists that human failings, betrayal, disrespect, cruelty, generate rightful consequences, making the gods' wrath a mirror of human ethics rather than mere caprice. Athena's interventions are often cloaked as education. She tests the characters of both Odysseus and his household by sending dreams, disguises, and calculated delays. Her desire for order and balance is more architect than avenger, but even architects must sometimes wield harsh tools. When Odysseus is given a chance to prove himself through cunning and strength, Athena is less judge than choreographer of outcomes that align with her vision of justice. Poseidon's sustained wrath is notable because it transforms the hero's journey from episodic adventure into a narrative of endurance. Each tempest that he raises removes a layer of safety and self-certainty from Odysseus, exposing him to the raw elements of being human. The sea becomes a crucible where identity is melted and reforged, and Poseidon's blows are the flames that effect that change. The gods' tests are not always violent. Sometimes they are long stretches of patience where endurance is the point. Odysseus' years on Calypso's island are hardly stormy in meteorological terms, but are tempestuous in moral and psychological sense. The gods impose delays as a form of discipline, teaching that the timing of return matters as much as the return itself. Divine wrath produces heroes as much as it punishes, for the ordeal shapes qualities admired in a culture. Suffering becomes a source of authority for Odysseus, whose stories are richer for their scars. Homer seems to argue that great deeds are often forged in contact with godly disfavor, which is an oddly optimistic view. Even suffering has dignity and meaning. The image of a god in motion is cinematic, a deity rising from Olympus, turning a shoulder, raising a hand, and the weather obeys as if hearing an order. These theatrical gestures dramatize divine temper and allow human actors to read the sky like a script. Such personification makes the invisible conversation between gods and mortals legible to listeners and readers alike. Human agency in the face of divine wrath is always a study in limited freedom. Men can pray, sacrifice, and perform, and sometimes the gods respond favorably, but many key outcomes are fixed or influenced by other actors. The poem explores this tension deeply, suggesting that the highest human virtue may be the ability to act virtuously while accepting the limits of power. The wrath of the gods in the poem is rarely portrayed as purely negative. It also renews and cleanses. Storms sweep away corruption much as a flood might clear a clogged channel. The violent acts that seem excessive to modern eyes often have an economy of purification in Homeric thought, where the social order is restored through decisive, sometimes brutal, correction. The gods' sense of time differs from mortal time, and this difference shapes their responses. A god can hold a grudge for decades without strain, while a man cannot. Because deities move across generations with ease, their punishments can be patient and cumulative, making the Odyssey itself a story not of isolated events but of long arcs of consequence. Mortals sometimes try to use the gods' wrath instrumentally, invoking storms as weapons or calling for divine help against enemies. Priests, kings, and cunning sailors understand that the gods' favor can be directed if one knows the right names and rights. This manipulation of divine wrath shows that the line between worship and coercion is thin when mortals seek to marshal fate. The gods also test loyalties within families, and family ties are often the medium for divine decisions. Zeus and Athena might judge a man partly on how he honors his parents, protects his children, and respects his spouse. The domestic sphere thus becomes the prime site where divine wrath or favor is negotiated, reinforcing the centrality of home and household in Greek thought. Odysseus' own identity is fractured and reassembled across encounters with the divine. He plays the hero, the beggar, the leader, and the deceiver as the situation demands, and the gods respond to these performances. Through their tests, they force him to reconcile these selves into the version that will finally stand before Penelope and the assembled suitors. Divine wrath is also theatrical in how it seeks witnesses. Gods often create signs in public so that communities can agree on what has happened. Thunderclaps, sudden calms, and miraculous survivals become common knowledge, reinforcing social memory and ensuring that divine lessons are no private experiences but communal references. Prophetic instruments, bird flight, smoke, strange births, are ways the gods inscribe their will into the material world. People trained to read these signs become power brokers because they help decide when to act. The god's wrath, therefore, is not only a personal vendetta but a public grammar that shapes communal decisions. Even the smallest scenes in the Odyssey bear the trace of divine surveillance, like the way Athena touches a man's eyelids or Zeus rumbles at a critical moment. These touches are intimate and decisive, proving that gods are not distant architects but active participants who engage the human psyche. In this way, divine wrath becomes something that shapes inner life as much as outward fate. The gods sometimes forgive as dramatically as they punish, and those moments reveal their complex personalities. Athena's final reconciliation of the families in Ithaca is quieter than the violence, but perhaps more telling. Order is not restored only by slaughter, but by the patient reweaving of social bonds. Forgiveness by a deity can be a more exacting mercy than immediate revenge because it requires human cooperation. Omens that precede wrath are often deliberate tests of interpretation, asking mortals to make choices that reveal character. When a sign appears, those who read it with prudence are rewarded, while those who misread are punished. The story thus values the capacity to interpret the world correctly, suggesting that wisdom is a survival skill that pleases the gods. Divine wrath also unfolds through moral irony, where those who intend to do wrong find that their instruments turn against them. The suitors plot to kill Telemachus and thus secure wealth, and power collapses under its own arrogance when Athena intervenes. Their fate is partly divine but also the natural outcome of their transgressions, which the gods amplify in order to make a moral point. The landscape of divine tests is broad, ranging from mythical monsters to subtler social deceptions. Monsters like the Cyclops or Scylla embody the fear of lawless, unreasoning violence, while deceptions among humans reflect moral decay. The gods choose which instrument to use based on the scale and kind of transgression, blending the cosmic with the civic. Even non-combatant characters feel the weight of divine scrutiny, such as the faithful slave Eumaeus, whose loyalty is tested through privation and delay. His reward is modest but profound, a reintegration into the social order that the gods endorse. Smaller characters, then, are not incidental. They are ways for the gods to demonstrate how ordinary virtue is recognized and recompensed. The epic draws a clear link between memory and the gods' favor, telling Odysseus' story is itself an act of piety. When tales of his wanderings are told to the elders and to the gods, they become preserved and sanctified. Thus the poem underscores that narrative memory is a guarantor of immortality, and to dishonor it is to risk divine censure. The gods' wrath can be seen in the silence they impose as much as in the storms they raise. Periods of abandonment are as meaningful as moments of intervention. Calypso's long quiet imprisonment of Odysseus is a form of willed isolation that forces reflection and longing. Divine absence is thus not merely absence but a kind of test in which patience and fidelity are examined. Temples and altars punctuate the Odyssey, and these sacred spaces mark the geography of divine testing. To pass a temple without offering is to risk a god's displeasure, while proper respect can unlock paths otherwise closed. In this sense, landscape and liturgy combine to create a topography of divine expectation that travelers must navigate. The gods' aesthetics matter. Their displeasure is often triggered by acts that offend beauty or proper proportion. A boorish act in a noble hall, a crude joke at a feast, or a disrespectful glance at a sacred object can trigger divine intervention. The gods are guardians of an aesthetic order as much as a moral one, and their wrath enforces standards of decorum. Heroes in Homer are judged by how they accept or defy divine tests, and Odysseus' greatness is measured by persistent negotiation with the gods. His identity is less a fixed glory than an evolving description shaped by divine encounters. To be a Homeric hero is to be in continual conversation with gods whose gifts and punishments require constant recalibration. Even after Odysseus returns and the main arc of revenge is complete, the gods continue to shape the ending with subtle acts of reconciliation. Athena's final act of smoothing tempers is like closing a book with a careful hand. It is both practical and symbolic. The gods' final interventions suggest that the restoration of order requires more than violence, it needs the blessing of the heavens. Through the centuries, the Odyssey has been read as both myth and manual, a guide to living under the gaze of higher powers. The sequence of tests and tempests teaches listeners that life is a balance of cunning, piety, and patience. The gods' wrath, in this sense, becomes a pedagogical device, instructing audiences on how to live inside the rules of a universe where power is shared between mortal wit and divine will. Listening to these episodes now, we can sense how the ancient world understood risk and responsibility. Where modern narratives might invoke random chance, Homer invokes the gods as moral agents, insisting that events are meaningful. The storms and trials of the Odyssey therefore read as a complex sermon on the human condition wrapped in the violent beauty of myth. The poem ultimately argues for a kind of humility that does not deny agency. Odysseus acts, plans, and sometimes deceives, but he does so in a context that accepts divine sovereignty. His cunning is not absolute, it is a skill exercised under limits, and his survival depends as much on his capacity to be patient as on his capacity to act decisively. The gods are jealous of their prerogatives, and this jealousy shapes the courses of human careers. Every mortal whom the gods love must show reverent restraint, otherwise divine favor can turn into fury. The Odyssey formalizes this rule in narratives that show how speed and greed often outpace prudence and respect. In the end, the gods' tests are a way to keep the world from stasis, to push both mortals and immortals into action. Wrath is one of their tools for enforcing change and maintaining balance. By observing their tempests and teachings, we learn not only about survival at sea, but about endurance in life, about patience amid the storms that time inevitably brings. The epic's enduring power comes from its insistence that the human and the divine cannot be neatly separated. Storms and tests make life epic because they force humans to confront ultimate questions of loyalty, identity, and justice in ways that ordinary days do not. The gods' wrath, then, is not merely punitive, it is the mechanism by which depth is added to human lives. As the narrative winds down and the household of Ithaca is reassembled, the echo of divine tempests remains like a sound recorded in stone. Even restored peace is tempered by the memory of storms, and that memory acts as a moral teaching for the future. The gods may relent, but their lessons echo long after, informing how people tell stories, hold rituals, and judge deeds. When you hear the Odyssey in a car or at home, the winds and thunder feel immediate because Homer gives them voice and shape. Each storm, each divine test, becomes a line in a human life where decision and destiny intersect. The poem invites listeners to imagine themselves afloat, to feel the cold wind, to understand that gods may test them too, albeit in modern forms like unexpected loss, fortune, or moral challenge. The gods, in the Homeric world, are not prophecies written in stone but interlocutors who shape character through pressure. Wrath is a pressure that fractures, polishes, and finally reveals essential qualities of people. In testing Odysseus, the gods extract the virtues they value: cleverness that serves justice, endurance that withstands seduction, and humility that recognizes the limits of human control. Finally, the Odyssey asks whether divine wrath is simply about punishment or also about meaning. The storms and trials seem cruel when isolated, yet together they form an arc that produces a man capable of returning, telling his story, and rebuilding. That is the paradox at Homer's heart: wrath can wound, but it can also make a wound into a path toward wisdom. To listen to the Odyssey is to be reminded that life's tempests are rarely meaningless. They may be the language the universe uses to teach balance and restraint, to test loyalty, and to insist that honor be preserved. In the end, the wrath of the gods is less about cruelty and more about a demanding pedagogy that, if endured, shapes a soul into something more than it began. When Odysseus and his men first sighted the smoke over the wood of the island, they thought at once of a hospitable hearth and a stranger's welcome. The island was Aeaea, ruled by Circe, a woman whose hands could change the shape of a man and whose voice could make the heart forget its aim. They approached with the casual hunger of sailors who have been at sea too long and who, in their exhaustion, mistake every sign for shelter. That mistake would cost some of them their human forms and much of their freedom before Odysseus's resolve and cunning pulled them back from oblivion. Circe's palace rose amid cypresses and laurels, not like a farmer's hut but with an opulence that made the men believe wealth of a different order might be theirs. She set a table as generous as the sea itself, and she moved among them with a ministrant's grace and a witch's certainty. The food she offered was laced with transformation, and the wine she poured ran through their limbs like warm forgetfulness. One by one the men, like flotsam succumbing to a tide, allowed the enchantment to alter them into swine, their minds dulled while their appetites stretched wider than before. When the change was complete, the sounds coming from the pen were not the cries of men but of animals, and yet if you listened closely you could hear the shadow of human lament beneath every grunt. They were not lost entirely. Their memories had not been cruelly excised but muffled, as if a heavy cloak had been thrown across the eyes of their minds. Circe did not gloat in a caricature of evil. She was a woman who exercised the power she had learned and mastered, and in her practice there was a lesson about desire and dominion. She held their bodies in new forms and their fates in a palm that warmed and cooled as she pleased. Odysseus did not enter her halls as one of the changed. He had been warned by a god with sharp eyes and an urgent gait, Hermes, who met him at the edge of the wood with both herb and counsel. Hermes did not simply hand him a talisman. He explained the rules of the place, the logic of the sorcery, the way a name and a memory could be protected from erosion. He pressed into Odysseus's hand the bitter root called moly, black-stemmed and white-bloomed, the counterspell against the sweetness of forgetfulness. With that herb, and with his wits trimmed to a keen edge, Odysseus walked into Circe's hall and into the space where temptation had been misnamed as hospitality. He resisted the drugged cup. He stood like a rock in a current that wished to turn him soft and movable. Circe, surprised and impressed, found in this man a curiosity, someone both human and cunning, someone who would not be swallowed by an easy life of hearth and plenty. Circe's response to resistance was not immediate hostility. She was a woman who had seen men break and men bow, and when she saw the unusual tenacity in Odysseus, she unrolled a different script. She invited him to lie with her and share a bed, and that invitation contained the double edge of solace and stasis. To accept would be to yield to a new existence, a life cushioned from storms and obligations. To refuse would mean to continue along a harder road toward a single goal that lay beyond the horizon. Odysseus chose to stay. He chose to stay, not simply because the bed was warm, but because staying became less and less a surrender and more a deliberate pause. For 1 year on Aeaea he was lodged in a room of soft light, his officers and friends restored to human form and housed in good company, and life flowed in gentle uncomplaining rhythms he had not felt since before the Trojan War. It was not a mere indulgence. Circe taught him to tend to his heart alongside the needs of a sailor, and she taught the men music in the comfort of bread and wine without salt of anxiety. If we count time by longing, that year is a long season. Odysseus allowed himself to be taught things that no shipboard academy would have offered him. He asked questions, she offered answers that had to do with routes and rights, with the geography of the world and the geography of the dead. Circe sent him, in the end, to seek out Tiresias, the seer in the land of the dead, because there are some futures that even sorcery cannot predict without the Vedic voice of the underworld. The decision to go to Hades was not taken lightly. It was a threshold crossing in a story that already thrummed with crossings, and even the word underworld suggests a pressure the living do not feel easily. Odysseus sailed westward and found a place on the shore where the earth meets the salt of the sea and the boundary between life and death is thin. He dug a trench, poured libations, and called with the will of a man who knows that the only way to steer a course home is to learn what the shades know of fate and the will of the gods. In the darkness of the place where the dead gather, names came back to him like cold winds. He raised his voice not to summon the dead for comfort, but to ask the necessary questions about home and the conduct of men. Tiresias answered with bluntness. He spoke of the trials to come and warned of a most dangerous temptation, the cattle of Helios, which the crew must not touch if they hope to survive. The prophet's speech was a map of choices and consequences, a ledger of what will be lawful and what will be sacrilege. Odysseus left the realm of shades with new information and a heavier heart, because knowledge in that place always bears a weight. The return to Circe's halls was itself a crossing of tone, from cold revelation back into the warmth of instruction. Circe listened and nodded and helped refine the plan. She taught him how to calm his crew for a dangerous passage, how to heave against winds that smell of death, and she supplied a kind of counsel that only someone who had held men in different forms could give. When the men set sail once more, the world seemed to be testing the lessons they had newly received. They navigated past sirens whose songs promised knowledge and ease and the seduction of a tale. Odysseus, remembering the warning of Circe and Tiresias, demanded that his men plug their ears and bind him to the mast. He wished to hear what the song had to say but refused to be moved by it. In that action he modeled a second kind of restraint, the desire to know without letting knowledge itself tip one into ruin. Having passed the sirens, the voyage tightened into narrower dangers. Scylla rose on one side of a rock, a creature with several heads that swallowed sailors like a mouth eats food. On the other side, Charybdis sucked the sea into a great maw and belched it out again, a whirlpool that could destroy a ship faster than grievance destroys a man. Tiresias had prepared Odysseus for the mechanical cruelty of such straits. He had told him it was better to lose a few men than to lose all, and thus to hold a course that would spare the ship itself even at the cost of comrades. Odysseus chose to steer closer to Scylla and away from the hungry vortex. He did not boast of the loss, and he did not weep like a weak man who did not know his duty. He made choices that were strategic and cold, and those choices branded him with a captain's solitude. Leadership in such moments is a solitary labor, and it seals the lips with grief that must be carried forward alone. The heads of Scylla snapped and men vanished. The ship shuddered on, a living thing mourning its own wounds for days afterward. What came next was an act of temptation dressed up as divine ownership. The ship drifted to the island of Thrinacia, the land of the sun god's sacred cattle. Here the crew were told, with the kind of instruction that comes from prophecy and is therefore impossible to obey without will, that to kill and eat those cattle would be to invite annihilation. Odysseus forbade it under oath, and the men made promises, but promises are brittle things when hunger presses hard against resolve. Hunger is a tyranny that does not respect prophecies. When the winds would not blow and the ship was moored by complacent calm, the men fell into a calculus of need that turned piety into desperation. Eurylochus, a man whose voice carried the weary logic of mutiny, argued that leaving the cattle untouched would mean certain death by starvation. They argued, they ate, and with each bite they ate the future that Tiresias had warned of, as if they could digest fate into something less forbidding. Helios noticed, so the story tells us, and the gods inclined toward indignation. The sun's anger is not a merely metaphorical heat, it becomes a juridical claim on honor that must be respected. He demanded justice and brought it with thunderous speed. Zeus answered by unloosing a storm that smashed the ship to splinters and sent the crew to the mercy of waves, leaving Odysseus afloat on boards and bitter in the mouth with what had been eaten for the sake of a hollow relief. Clinging to wreckage and to the residue of a captain's purpose, Odysseus watched his men drown and felt the loneliness like a new weight. He drifted without bearings until Poseidon, who had not forgiven Odysseus for blinding his son Polyphemus, drove him past the edges of known navigation and threw him toward an island of mythic seclusion. The island was Ogygia, and on it dwelt Calypso, a nymph whose power rivaled the goddess in its domesticated form. To say that Odysseus arrived broken simplifies neither the body nor the spirit. He was a man whose villages were the seas and whose family remained a thought sharpened by year after year of absence. Calypso found him naked to all but his manhood and offered the immediate comfort of shelter, food, and a home that would not be broken by storms. She set him by a fire, dressed his wounds, and the island itself did the rest. Its groves and springs calmed the fist of his panic and turned his grief into a paler ache. Calypso was no Circe to be merely witching wine with transforms. She was a goddesskin who could offer a life without decay, without death, and without the ordinary demands of a mortal household. She was careful and tender and attentive in ways that would have been hard to find in mainland halls. She spoke with the authority of a goddess who can both shield a man from harm and steal his name by making him love her instead of his past. For 7 years, as the poets tell us, Odysseus lived in a sort of gilded exile. He had a house built by the sea that fit to his person, with a bed that Calypso herself fashioned to her liking and with table and board that would have made any mortal proud. He could have asked for nothing more and, were he a different kind of man, perhaps would have stayed there forever, letting the world drift away as his hair grayed in the sun. Instead, the distance between what was easy and what was true kept moving in him like an unanswered question. Calypso urged him toward a life of shared eternity. She promised rest from wandering, safety from the caprice of the gods, and a form of love that would not be interrupted by the dawn. She offered him divine wedlock and the easy bliss of immortality at her side. Yet every gift she strewed before him was also a chain in the grammar of choice. To accept would be to resign his claim to a household on Ithaca and to rename his shipwreck a new center. What made the temptation of Calypso an especially acute test was not its sensual ease, but the philosophical weight of immortal security. To be a lord in a place without law other than love is an alluring fate. It changes the stakes. Instead of choosing between two mortal endpoints, Odysseus would trade mortality and its duties for an existence that let grief soften into never-ending contentment. That was a strange bargain for a man whose identity had been built in the crucible of loss and oath. Odysseus himself was not an obvious candidate for surrender. He had a mind that loved plans, people who needed him, and the image of Penelope at home unweaving her nights. Memory of her was not simply a relic of fidelity, it was the map he used to navigate the miles between what is felt and what is owed. His face grew older, and the sea cut lines into his shoulders, but his thought toward home remained a visceral pull like a current under the current of the tide. Calypso's affection was not unkind. She gave him books of comfort if the island had them, and songs, and a place in her company. She laid out for him the logic of abundance and the promise of an end to wandering. But for all of the comfort there was also the ache of roots unplanted, a life without the small domestic proofs that had shaped his earlier manhood, the combining of patience and craft that Penelope practiced in every day and every night. To remain with Calypso would have been to accept the world rewritten in terms that would let him forget the hard work of fidelity. The goddess did not compel him through force so much as seduce him with the plausibility of rest. She tended to his wounds and played to his need for human tenderness, and Odysseus, exhausted past the point of a normal man's reserve, once more hesitated at the threshold of resignation. He considered the offer with the weary rationality of a man who has seen both delight and disaster. The gods, however, had not finished with him. Far away on Olympus, the rumor of a man stranded on an island with a goddess reached the ears of Athena, whose heart had been stitched with an odd and persistent care for Odysseus. She delegated her interest into action. She went to Zeus to advocate for the man's return because the narrative of human life, she understood, required closure of certain kinds that even indulgent goddesses cannot grant. Zeus, who had long presided over the ledger of divine and mortal claims, sent Hermes to deliver a command. There is a marvel in the thought of a messenger god bringing word down to a solitary couple on a green and breathing shore. Hermes' speech was precise: release Odysseus and allow him to go. Calypso, who loved with goddessly ache, protested softly, but in the face of Zeus's will even a nymph must bow. Calypso's obedience was not an erasure of her feelings. She negotiated, in the shadows of grievance and grace, over how the letting go ought to look. She offered him again a share in the immortality she proffered, a life without mortality's sharpness. Odysseus declined, not out of cruelty but out of an allegiance to a life defined by finite ends and human duties. His refusal was an affirmation that to live well sometimes requires accepting the boundary and all the obligations it imposes. Calypso helped him build a raft, working with the magic of the island and her own practical resources. The ship was not a palace but a necessary tool, a plank-borne answer to fate. He loaded provisions the way a man who has learned from scarcity measures them, carefully, with a mind for how hunger and thirst sharpen both hope and despair. She patched him with herbs and winds and sent him on his way with the goddess's watchful sorrow. Poseidon, who had been nursing grudges like an old wound, did not intend to let such a passage be easy. He watched as one small human figure took to the sea on a humble raft and decided that if the gods' will is mixed with human will, then the sea will test and perhaps destroy it. He summoned storms with the passion of an insulted god and overturned the raft in a demonstration of divine muscle. Panic and perseverance became locked in the captain's hands, and Odysseus, exhausted beyond reason, paddled toward survival with the stubbornness gifted to him by his fate. The open ocean is a theater where the gods take their small revenge and grand lessons both. Odysseus clung to wreckage and drifted for days until he found land at last, the shores of the Phaeacians, another interruption in the chain of detours. There he was found by women and children, by a royal household who would listen and then send him home with gifts and a crew. The journey from Circe to Calypso and back out into the world had been an excavation of the self, and in the telling to strangers he recovered some of his identity as a man anchored by memory and duty. If we look at these episodes as temptation in stages, Circe is the temptation of ease and sensual transformation, sirens the temptation of knowledge without cost. Scylla and Charybdis, the temptation of choosing which loves or goods to lose for the greater good, the sun's cattle, the temptation of immediate survival at the cost of the future, and Calypso, the temptation of immortality and endless comfort. Each one offered a plausible counterargument to Odysseus's Nostos, and each one tested a different faculty: cunning, patience, prioritization, restraint, and fidelity. Taken together, they form a trial by attrition that sculpts the hero's character through steady attrition rather than a single apocalyptic test. There is also a rhythm to these temptations that speaks to Homeric craft. Homer does not throw trials arbitrarily, he arranges them to show the development of a man and a moral economy. The narrative moves from the personal to the communal and from the physical to the metaphysical. First, the body is at stake in Circe's transformation, then the soul is at stake with the sirens, then the community is at stake with Scylla and the sun's cattle, and finally the life course itself is at stake with the offer of immortality. The progression is a taxonomy of human desire in which Odysseus is both specimen and experimenter. Circe and Calypso are often read as two sides of the same coin, two kinds of female figures who offer a man the refuge of the other world. Yet they differ. Circe's enchantment is an active alteration of human shape and social order, whereas Calypso's seduction is more about indefinite rest and the end of obligation. One turns men into animals to keep them close, the other promises to replace the ache of mortality with the soft blanket of eternal warmth. In both cases, Odysseus resists enough to retain the story he tells, not simply the body that houses him. The temptations are also social. To accept Circe's way would have been to become a householder in a different mode, to trade the risks of a return for the obligations of a new court. To accept Calypso's offer would be to remake the radical social contract of a human life, because immortality dissolves the everyday proofs that hold marriages and households together. These choices are less about pleasure and more about the kind of person one wants to be, a man who pledges to a single home or a man who remakes his loyalties to suit the comforts of the present. There is another layer, political and theological, to these episodes. The gods are not neutral backdrop but active forces with competing agendas. Athena favors Odysseus, Poseidon resents him, Calypso and Circe, though powerful, must accommodate Zeus's decrees. The story becomes not merely about a man learning to say no but about a mortal shaped by divine conversations whose terms he cannot entirely control. The hero's agency is simultaneously affirmed and limited by the caprices of higher beings. This tension is part of what makes his reverence for home and oath all the more meaningful. For a listener driving down a highway or folding laundry in a quiet kitchen, these layers of temptation may sound like reflections on a single human problem: how to make a choice that will not be painful in every sense. Odysseus's saga suggests that there is no simple avoidance of pain, only the labor of selecting the shape of it. He learns that the wounds he will carry are the price paid for the life he chooses. Being a husband in Ithaca requires the acceptance of loss and the endurance of time. This endurance is what Homer means by nostos, the return, which is not simply a physical arrival but a moral and social reintegration. Tempering desire with duty is the art practiced in these episodes, and Odysseus becomes a model for a kind of civic virtue that is personal as much as it is public. When he declines Calypso's immortality, it is as if he chooses to be a man who can be counted on in a household instead of a figure who occupies a throne of endless leisure. There is a curious inversion here. Immortality, which in some stories is the highest good, is in the Odyssey a threat to social coherence. An immortal partner would be a perpetual distraction from the reciprocal labor that keeps a home intact. The story implies that finite life is itself a binding good, because its limits give value to promises and urgency to duties. Calypso's offer is seductive precisely because it dissolves that urgency and in doing so threatens the very fabric of human ties. The psychology of Odysseus in these years is layered. He is weary, yes, but also capable of a clarity that exhaustion makes harsher rather than softer. He oscillates between gratitude for compassion and a stubborn allegiance to the past. He is not always noble. Sometimes he is focused on his own survival with a pragmatism that is hard to separate from ruthlessness. Yet when it comes to the matter of Penelope and the home of Ithaca, a deeper current of longing moves him beyond the sway of even the most tender goddess. The music of these episodes, when read aloud as Homer intended, underscores both the danger and the seduction. The poet lingers on details that make Circe's hall almost tactile, describing the warm breaths of swine and the glittering cups that almost glowed with enchantment. He dwells on Calypso's groves and the sweep of her hands as she tends the man she loves. Those lyrical moments are not merely decoration but an ethical gradient, showing how pleasurable things incline toward reflections that can be used to judge them. As an audience in the present, hearing the tale in a car or at a bedside, we are asked to consider our own diversions and deferred duties. Circe's potion could be the social media scroll that transforms attention into a soft animality. Calypso's island could be any comfortable refuge that offers a permanent forgetting. The Odyssey, although ancient in its language, offers a surprisingly modern objection to the tyranny of comfort, the idea that what is pleasurable in the moment might be the death of the life you most value. The figure of Tiresias in the underworld, called upon between Circe and the final temptations, plays an essential role in anchoring Odysseus to the longer arc of consequence. It is not enough to see comfort, one must also forecast the costs. Tiresias' speech reminds Odysseus that the world has rules that outlast immediate gratification, and that the soul's navigation is as important as the body's route. The prophet's words become a kind of contract with the future, a record of the shape of choice written in ink that does not smudge with tears. Odysseus's mode of memory is itself instructive. He carries stories of the dead and the living as if they were cargo, and some of that luggage is heavier than it should be. He remembers in images and episodes, and Homer leads the listener through a series of recollections that form a mosaic of why he cannot stay on any island for good. Each memory is a stitch in the fabric of identity, and losing a stitch to Circe's charm or Calypso's lure would be to unravel the garment of self. The men who die at Scylla, or who perish in the wreck after the cattle of Helios are eaten, become, in a sense, sacrifices that render the narrative morally costly. These deaths are not instruments of nihilism, they are, in the moral economy of the poem, the price of choices that are made by human hands. They are citizen deaths, and that their fates are woven into the public story of returning and rebuilding. Each lost man becomes a cautionary figure and a reminder of the fragile tether between individual appetite and communal survival. How does Homer make this familiar territory feel perpetually new? He works in contrasts and careful pacing. Circe's intimacy follows the slaughter of Troy and the brutality of pirates, and Calypso's offer follows the slow grief of shipwreck. Each episode is a colored tile in a broad mosaic, and Homer circles back to the same themes with new variations: love, cunning, loyalty, and the corrosive charm of ease. The repetition is not redundancy, it is the way to make a listener feel the weight of temptation as a recurring human condition. The narrative also uses the gods to reflect human states. Hermes' practical intervention, Athena's persistent advocacy, and Poseidon's wrath are not mere mythic fireworks, they symbolize aspects of fortune and fate that shape mortal decisions. The gods in the Odyssey behave like family members with different temperaments, each insisting on their interpretations of right action. The result is that Odysseus's decisions, though deeply personal, are made under the scrutiny of a universe that refuses simple resolutions. We should not forget the domestic image that anchors Odysseus, Penelope at the loom, and the simple hospitality of Ithaca. That image is the lodestar against which all temptations are measured. Even in the softness of Calypso's bed, he dreams sporadically of a woman who tapes spare rope and conceals her cunning in the slow loom of household life. Penelope is not passive, she is a participant in the test, a patient exemplar of fidelity who weaves and unweaves her nights to maintain a lifeline until Odysseus can return. It is this faithfulness that gives Odysseus the ethical framework to say no to immortality. He is not rejecting a joyless immortality, he is rejecting a joy that would cost him his moral bearings. This subtlety matters. He does not scorn Calypso's goodness, nor does he trivialize Circe's welcome. He simply refuses to let his life be rearranged by pleasures that exempt him from the hard business of being a husband, a father, a king, and a man of his word. The interplay between gods and humans in these episodes also reveals a meditation on free will. Odysseus is free to act, and however the gods postulate and nudge, his choices matter. That is the radical moral claim at the center of the Odyssey. Human choices have force even when the universe is populated by powerful beings who can tilt circumstances. This is why Odysseus's refusal, his steady insistence on returning to a mortal life, is such a pivotal moral act. It affirms the dignity of human obligation in a cosmos that often seems indifferent. Narratively, the time Odysseus spends with Circe and Calypso functions as a study in pacing and delay. Homer slows the tale down in these episodes to examine what delay does to identity and loyalty. Delays are not merely obstacles in the road, they are tests, educations, and sometimes corruptions. By slowing the rhythm of the story, the poet asks listeners to hold their own attention and to examine what they do in the face of repeated ease. There is also an aesthetic pleasure in the contrasts between Circe's gardens of transformation, the wild music of the sirens, the coiled terror of Scylla and Charybdis, the sacrificial stupidity that dooms the crew on Thrinacia, and the lush solitude of Calypso's island. Homer delights in describing places with the same care he gives to internal states, and the physical world becomes a series of metaphors for what Odysseus must confront. The listener moves from scene to scene almost cinematically, feeling both the weather and the moral winds that buffet the hero. Modern readers and listeners often find in these episodes analogies for contemporary life. The easy pleasures turn gifts, the relentless distractions that fragment attention, and the trade-offs between security and fidelity are themes that survive across millennia. The Odyssey thus remains a reflective mirror. We too are tempted by our own versions of Circe and Calypso, and we too must choose the kind of finite life that will make sense when the days run out. In that sense, the poem is less a remote myth than an instruction manual for living among persistent desires. Consider briefly the figure of the crew, who are less fully drawn than Odysseus but no less important. Their choices and failings are communal warnings. They do not always act with the hero's clarity, sometimes they succumb to baser needs. But their humanity adds texture to the tale, showing that heroism depends not only on one man's virtue but on the fragility of a group of men worn down by hunger, storm, and the long boredom of the sea. When Odysseus narrates these parts of the tale to the Phaeacians, there is a self-consciousness to his retelling. He knows his audience and shapes the story to both entertain and exculpate himself. He emphasizes his cleverness and his sufferings, and the listeners, moved by both, decide to honor him. This meta-narrative aspect of the Odyssey, the way stories are told, tailored, believed, and rewarded, is central to the poem's meditation on memory and identity. Another strand is the moral ambiguity Homer allows his hero. Odysseus is not a morally unblemished figure. He is a man who makes choices that are cruel or pragmatic. The deaths he engineers and allows are not sanctified acts but ugly necessities. Yet even when he errs, the narrative frames him as the sort of man who can learn and who will carry his lessons forward. This emphasis on moral complexity gives the story the depth of a long human life rather than the narrow heroism of a single victory. The endings of these temptations are instructive. Circe becomes an ally, not a vanquished enemy, and Calypso submits to the law of divine consensus. Both women, in the end, are not erased but integrated into a cosmos where the gods hold conversations with one another and with mortals. Their roles are transformed from obstacles to participants in a wider order. The poem thus suggests that temptations, once recognized and refused or negotiated, can become teachers and allies instead of merely enemies to be defeated. We might consider too the symbolism of transformation and return. Circe's enchantment of men into swine speaks to the ease with which dignity can be traded for immediate gratification, and the return from that state speaks to the hard work of rehumanization. Calypso's offer of immortality speaks to a different kind of transformation, one that would transmute mortality into permanence. The narrative's insistence on return, on nostos, is an insistence that transformation must be judged by whether it preserves or erases the self we owe to others. If the Odyssey were merely a tale of stopping and starting, it would be a lesser work. But the richness comes from the ways Homer invests each delay with a moral and psychological texture. Circe has lessons, Tiresias has prophecies, the sirens have a kind of dangerous wisdom, the cattle teach the cost of immediate relief, and Calypso gives the ultimate philosophical bargain. Taken as a whole, the episodes teach a listener about living against temptation in a world where every comfort can be transformed into an excuse. Even the divine law that intervenes to free Odysseus from Calypso's island carries a lesson about cosmopolitan justice. The poem implies that there is an order larger than personal affection and even the will of the most tender goddess. That order sometimes compels sacrifice and sometimes insists on restitution. It is a balancing act that suggests the gods are not solely capricious but are concerned with a kind of cosmic harmony, even if their methods are messy and their judgments inscrutable. The way the story is told also invites us to sympathize with the temptresses. Circe is not portrayed as simply wicked. She is, many critics would argue, a figure of knowledge and hospitality who combines both art and domestic skill. Calypso is not a mere obstacle either. She is an image of love as a force that can both save and subvert. Homer gives them voices of sorrow and complaint, and that humane treatment complicates the easy narrative of hero versus enemy. It makes us, as listeners, more thoughtful about the nature of the choices Odysseus makes and the legitimacy of the loves he refuses. For anyone living a life split between duties and delights, the Odyssey's messages are particular and piercing. The poem asks us to ask which pleasures we will perfect into a way of life and which we will hold with the hands of a traveler who intends to let go. To remain human is to accept limits, and to honor promises is to let those limits shape you. Odysseus's story, especially in the arc from Circe to Calypso, is a long meditation on the painful but steady work of choosing limits rather than letting them be enforced by fate. The style of the telling, its long similes, sudden catalogues, and intimate moments of interiority, invites a listener into both a man's exterior trials and his private reckonings. Homer never allows the narrative to dissolve into mere adventure. Adventure is the surface. What lies below are questions about identity, time, and the stakes of earthly loyalties. Those undercurrents keep the story anchored as Odysseus drifts from enchantment to enchantment, always toward the central and patient concern of home. In the end, the arc between Circe and Calypso rewrites the idea of temptation as simply a moment of weakness. Instead, temptation is a set of conditions that test what matters most, and refusing a temptation is not just an act of will but an affirmation of what one intends to live for. Odysseus is not static in his refusals. He learns, he suffers, and he becomes more himself the more he resists. That paradox, that resistance produces identity rather than diminishes it, is one of the Odyssey's deepest moral claims. Listeners may notice too the recurrent motif of hospitality that runs through these episodes. Each island offers a variant of xenia, the ancient code of guest friendship. Circe's hospitality is twisted by sorcery, Calypso's by possessiveness, the Phaeacians by generosity, and even the sun god's domain by the absence of wise governance. Homer uses hospitality to test the moral terrain of mortals and immortals alike, showing that how we receive strangers and how we behave as guests reveals our real character more clearly than any battlefield can. When interpreting these episodes for a contemporary ear, we might hear in them warnings about substitution, the substitution of easy pleasures for the hard work of community, the substitution of private satisfaction for public responsibility, and the substitution of immortal ease for the mortal labors that make lives meaningful. The voice of the poem does not denounce pleasure, it instructs in proportion and purpose. Circe and Calypso are not the problem because they give comfort, they are a problem because they propose to make comfort the primary end of life. Homer's craft also invites readers to recognize the mechanisms of nostalgia. Odysseus's longing for home is not an abstract feeling but a recall of specific acts and textures, a man's bed, a woman's cunning, the sound of a dog at the gate. Those details are what make his refusals credible and painful. The more you know what a man misses, the more understandable it is when he chooses to return, come storms, sirens, and seductions. We should also attend to the wholly human detail of shame in Odysseus's reactions. Shame is a near-constant companion when a leader sees his men fail, when he eats the bad bread of compromise, or when he watches a ship sink under the weight of disobedience. Odysseus's path is marked by a conscious humility born of suffering. He learns to bear shame without letting it harden into cruelty, and that learning is part of the moral texture of his voyage. Consider finally the lingering echo of these episodes in later storytelling. Authors and listeners through centuries have returned to Circe and Calypso as archetypes of female power, temptation, and hospitality. Their persistence in the cultural imagination suggests that the questions they pose about desire, memory, and duty are not confined to any age or culture. The Odyssey thus remains a living conversation about what it takes to be human in a world full of wise and dangerous gifts. It is tempting, as any reader or listener feels, to want a neatly tied ending that erases all ambiguity. Homer refuses that consolation, and instead he gives complexity. Circe becomes a helper, Calypso a lover who is lost but understood. Odysseus, scarred and wiser, resumes his path in a world that has not simplified itself for him. In the steady heartbeat of his nostos there is a lesson about accepting complexity without becoming cynical. Even as Odysseus sails away from Calypso's island on a raft of his own making, the echo of her voice and the memory of her hands remain with him. They are like the smell of a meal long after the plate has been cleared. Those memories do not detract from his claim to Ithaca, rather, they prove the breadth of human feeling and the capacity to love in multiple registers. They teach him that to be faithful is not to be single-hearted but to choose with intention and to carry the memory of those choices as ballast. The sea is a teacher of endurance and an illustrator of fate. It carries Odysseus forward in spite of storms and in spite of gods who would thwart him. The raft he builds and the craft he pilots are both modest. They speak to a man who has learned to rely on himself and on the mercy of those he meets. In his small hand he preserves the capacity to tell his story, to name his losses, and to grant meaning to the pain of delay. Listening to the tale unfold in succession, one can see the continuity. Circe's lesson about transformation feeds directly into his care with the sirens and his grieving for the lost men at Scylla. Calypso's offer makes him think again about the nature of mortality and the weight of promises. The narrative trains us to hear temptation not as a singular event, but as a layered chorus that becomes clearer with each repetition. Odysseus's life, tested and prolonged by the detours, becomes proof that a man can become more himself in the slow hard work of refusal. The beauty of the Odyssey is in its refusal to simplify and in its insistence that human life is made up of many small returns rather than a single triumphant homecoming. That is the core lesson of the stretch from Circe to Calypso. Delays are not merely things that keep you from your goal, they are the place where character is formed. The temptations themselves, if resisted or rightly integrated, contribute to the man who finally stands at the gates of Ithaca with a memory that is both sharper and softer for having been tested. To drift from one enchantment to the next is, perhaps, to drift through the varieties of human need. Circe tended the need for comfort and the temptation to change one's nature for the sake of that comfort. The sirens addressed the hunger for knowledge without cost. The robbery of the godson cattle dramatized the conflict between immediate survival and transgenerational obligation. Calypso offered a new metaphysical possibility, immortality at the cost of the past. Each of those needs is timeless, and Odysseus's navigation of them is the kind of instruction a life offers to a listener who must choose among conflicting goods. If there is a final note to strike on these episodes, it is that the right life is not one of unending pleasure nor of unrelieved austerity, but of deliberate fidelity. Odysseus returns to a Penelopean fidelity that is chosen repeatedly in the face of other reasonable offers. In the long act of choosing, he becomes a figure of resistance to the blandishments of the immediate and a testament to the possibility that finite choices, made with attention, can yield a life worth returning to. And so, as the story folds in on itself and Odysseus continues his nostos, the listener can carry away a kind of practical philosophy. Resist temptations that demand surrender, accept delays as educations, let memory be a compass rather than a chain. Odysseus's voyage from Circe to Calypso is a long lesson in this doctrine, told in images of weeds and wine, of mouths that feed and mouths that threaten, and of island shores that promise everything and, in doing so, ask us what we truly value. The story begins not at the moment of violence, but in the hush of expectation that hangs over Ithaca like a long winter. For 20 years a house has been strained thin by absence, the husband wrapped in rumor and the son stretched toward manhood without the stabilizing shape of his father. Those who wait in such circumstances learn to measure time differently. Days are not just counted but catalogued as losses and possible returns, as debts and promises, as spaces where grief and hope braid themselves into stubborn endurance. That is the quiet stage where the drama of homecoming will unspool, where the question of what a household needs when its head returns will be as pressing as the question of how the man who returns has been changed. Odysseus's voyage home is the backbone of memory for the people of Ithaca, a narrative told and retold until its edges blur and harden at once. For those left behind, myth accumulates around the missing like barnacles on an unseen hull, names of islands, monstrous encounters, the interference of gods, all become part of a communal shorthand that keeps the missing man present. Yet the Odyssey is not merely a travel tale, it is a slow reweaving of authority and belonging, and when Odysseus arrives it is as much to reckon as to be welcomed. The homecoming, or nostos, poses the most delicate questions: who has the right to the house and the name within it, and what must be done when those rights are contested? There are two axes of return that meet in Ithaca, the personal and the political. On the personal level, a husband returns to a wife who has been faithful in absence by some measures and not by others, and to a son who has grown into his father's voice and longings. On the political level, a king returns to a kingdom that has been hollowed by men who refuse to accept that the war is over, men who suppose that a throne is an empty thing, a promise unclaimed. It is here, at the intersection of personal betrayal and public disorder, that vengeance and justice fight for precedence. Vengeance in this tale is not a private, petty impulse but an institution with customs, rituals, and expectations. In the world of Homer, the household is a juridical unit and the master of that unit wields not only economic control but moral and legal authority. If a stranger eats your bread, sleeps in your bed, courts your wife, and squanders your estate, the offense is as much against the social order as it is against the individual. This is why the slaughter of the suitors is framed by the epic as a rectifying action, a re-establishment of the household's moral geometry. Still, vengeance alone cannot stand as the final word in a functioning polity. The act of killing without ceremony risks unmooring society from standards and replacing law with a cycle of blood and reprisal. The question of whether Odysseus's actions are vindication or cruelty is complicated by the cultural assumptions of the time. The ancient audience would have understood rule, hospitality, and xenia, guest friendship, as sacrosanct. For them, the suitor's transgressions dissolve the protective boundaries that hold civic life together, and thus the reclaiming of the house is both personal and necessary to restore order. When Odysseus returns disguised as a beggar, the disguise offers more than a plot device, it is a moral and psychological probe. Disguise allows him to observe how his household has endured, to test loyalties, and to measure the depth of the rot around his hearth. In that fragile space between knowing and being known, Odysseus gathers evidence. He gauges Telemachus's nerve, he hears Penelope's laments and wiles. He notes which servants remain steadfast and which have compromised themselves. It is a period of reconnaissance that heightens the sense of betrayal and clarifies the stakes before any violent reckoning happens. Penelope's role in the narrative is often misread when she is reduced to the figure of the faithful wife waiting at the loom. Her endurance is real, but so is her agency. She negotiates with suitors through cunning, delay, and the slim authority she wields as queen of an empty court. The famous shroud ruse, she unravels by night what she weaves by day, exemplifies a different kind of resistance, one that is patient and circuitous rather than overtly confrontational. When the master returns, her reception of him is not a simple collapse of sorrow into joy, it is a test and a cautious reading of what the man who claims to be her husband has become. The young Telemachus is at once an heir and a symbol of continuity, but he also bears the burden of adolescence turned prematurely into guardianship. His journey to Pylos and Sparta is a rite of passage, a phased step toward becoming the actor he will need to be beside his father. The reunion scene between father and son is written like a reconciliation between two different kinds of authority, the old, trickster kingly cunning embodied by Odysseus, and the emerging, more public leadership that Telemachus must model. Their alliance is crucial because it models how intimate vengeance can be transformed into a political restoration when the son stands by the father's claim yet uses it to buttress communal stability. When the violence begins in earnest, Homer compresses dread and relief into a choreography of simple, devastating acts: the bow, the arrows, the falling bodies. The scene is precise in its economy, no elaborate speeches, only the grim logistics of righting a wrong. But beneath the practicalities lies a flood of emotion, anger curdles into purpose, grief is steadied by the need to establish an example, and the killer must be both precise and theatrically righteous. Odysseus's aim with the bow is not merely physical but symbolic, to show that his claim is legitimate, that the instruments of his household, the tools, the bed, the bow, are still under his hand. The deaths are not merely punitive but pedagogical, they are designed to reteach a community about the sanctity of boundaries. Each suitor's fall is a lesson addressed to those who would confuse hospitality with entitlement. The penalties are severe because the violation is systemic. The suitors have used the communal space of the hall to enact private greed in front of the community's eyes, corrupting the table and bride as they did so. In restoring the household, Odysseus restores the grammar of social rights and responsibilities that the suitors had perverted. Yet even as the community sees justice being done, the specter of excess haunts the moment. The slaughter is brutal, swift, and absolute, and it does not allow for legal procedures that a more formal polity might require. There is no trial, no deliberative assembly, no appeals, only immediate retribution. This immediacy points to a tension at the heart of the epic, the need to contain disorder fast enough that it cannot metastasize, and the need to do so in a way that does not itself become monstrous. The poem invites the listener to sit in that uneasy moral seat and to consider how societies manage the line between necessary punishment and tyranny. The aftermath of violence is always quieter than the moment of its enactment, but it is no less consequential. Bodies must be accounted for, weapons must be recovered, and the household must be cleansed of the stain of transgression. In the Homeric world, purification is as much about ritual as about legal reparation. Burial rites, libations, and vows re-establish the proper relations between the living and the dead and appease the offended gods. Odysseus and his kin must walk the delicate path of ritual responsibility where private wrath is converted into public restitution. Reconciliation in the epic does not come without strenuous work. When relatives of the slain suitors rise in anger and threaten to ignite new waves of blood, the possibility of civic rupture is real. It is here that the intervention of gods and moderating voices matters, as does the clever diplomacy that draws a line under the past without negating the pain it caused. Athena, and occasionally other deities, alter hearts or orchestrate peace, reminding both parties that the stability of Ithaca benefits the living. The poem suggests that divine sanction must follow human action if order is to be durable. But divine sanction alone cannot substitute for human legislation, and the reconstitution of Ithaca requires human speech and agreement. The elders, the survivors, the neighbors, and the kin must negotiate the terms of peace, as much to avoid further bloodshed as to legitimize Odysseus's rule. The resolution involves acknowledgement of wrongdoing, measures for reparation, and a reassertion of familiar laws about property, marriage, and succession that had been neglected during the long absence. In this sense, the homecoming culminates as a civic refounding, a ceremony of reestablishment more than a unilateral victory. One of the most compelling elements of the story is how it interrogates the idea of justice itself. Justice is shown as a pluralistic concept, part personal honor, part communal order, part divine will, and these elements sometimes conflict. Odysseus's private grievance legally overlaps with the public code and the gods' judgment, and the narrative does not simplify these overlaps into neat moral boxes. Instead, it dramatizes their collisions, letting the listener probe the messy reality where retribution, due process, and forgiveness intersect and diverge. That messiness is also moral. Odysseus is not a paragon of unalloyed goodness. He is cunning to the point of ruthlessness and often unflinching in acts that would strike modern sensibilities as harsh. Yet the poem invites us to hold these traits in tension. He is both a protector and a destroyer, both a man who secures his household and a figure who crosses into moral ambiguity in doing so. This ambivalence is part of the text's enduring power because it refuses to let us sit comfortably with simple verdicts. The listener is thus drawn into ethical contemplation as the narrative unfolds. Part of the enduring fascination with the homecoming is how physical space becomes moral space. The bed that Odysseus made himself, rooted into a living olive tree, becomes a litmus test of identity when Penelope questions it. The bed's peculiar immovability proves to her that the man at her side is truly her husband. The household's architecture, the threshold, the courtyard, and the hall are not mere settings but witnesses to vows and violations. Restoring them is to restore the memory of promises kept and the capacity for future faith. Renewal in the poem is never purely symbolic, it has practical, economic dimensions. Land must be tended, debts settled, slaves and servants reorganized into functioning labor, and alliances renewed through hospitality and exchange. A kingdom undone by prolonged war and occupation cannot be fixed by a single night of retribution. It takes the slow work of reorganizing resources, reaffirming obligations, and reestablishing trade and hospitality networks. The homecoming, then, initiates a project of rebuilding that extends well beyond the palace walls into the fields and harbors of Ithaca. The treatment of the suitors' families and allies after the slaughter reveals another layer of the story's complexity. They are not simply faceless foes, they are kin and neighbors who will continue to inhabit the island. The choice to negotiate and to find a settlement, mediated by the elders and sanctioned by Athena, is a recognition that long-term peace requires some form of accommodation. The poem suggests that even when force is used to dispel immediate corruption, wisdom must follow in the form of forgiveness or pragmatic settlement to prevent perpetual blood feuds. Hospitality, or xenia, proves to be a theological cornerstone in the poem's moral economy, and its violation is the most damning offense the suitors commit. In the sacred code of guest friendship, hosts and guests exchange protection and respect. To transgress this code is to invite not only social condemnation but divine wrath. Odysseus's reclamation of his home is framed as an act of restoring this sacred balance. As the suitors are punished, the social and cosmic orders are recalibrated, and the gods' favor, previously withdrawn, is slowly restored. The role of the chorus-like figures, the old nurse Euryclea, loyal shepherds, and the old swineherd Eumaeus, adds texture to this restoration. Their loyalty is not just personal but representative. These figures embody the networks of affection and duty that sustain a household beyond its noble head. Eumaeus' simple heart and steady faithfulness become a moral mirror against which the suitor's decadence is revealed. When Odysseus reveals himself to them, the emotional return is as important as the physical reconquest, because these relationships constitute the core of what he has risked his life to protect. A close reading of the narrative reveals a careful choreography of secrecy and revelation that drives the drama. The beggar's concealment, the secret testing of Penelope, the staged archery contest, each element staggers revelation so that recognition becomes its own poetic justice. This slow unveiling allows the audience to feel the satisfaction of truth emerging from deception, yet it also forces the listener to confront the moral ambiguities of the means. The poem thus constructs a moral suspense that hinges on the ethical calculus of disguise and disclosure. Recognition scenes are deployed not merely for catharsis but for epistemic meaning. They teach characters and audience alike to distinguish between appearance and reality. Penelope's hesitation before accepting Odysseus, Telemachus's tentative acceptance of his father, and the servant's affirmations all operate as a communal learning process. The poem explores how identity is confirmed through narrative memory, physical proof, and moral reliability, and how those confirmations bear on the legitimacy of vengeance that follows. The recognition is thus both intimate confirmation and public validation. The social consequences of Odysseus's vengeance extend into the legal imagination of the community. What does it mean to be king after a king returns and takes the law into his own hands? The poem suggests that kingship must be more than mere strength. It must be coupled with the capacity to secure peace, to adjudicate fairly, and to make sacrifices to the gods on behalf of the polis. Odysseus's later actions show him taking on this mantle. He does not simply revel in conquest, but steps into the complex duties of reconstituting civic life. Renewed rule therefore becomes a project, and the epic traces its contours carefully. Part of what makes the Odyssey's homecoming so resonant is the attention paid to memory and reputation. Stories that travelers bring back in songs sung in halls are the lifeblood of a culture that preserves itself through narrative. Odysseus's name is not merely a label but a repository of deeds, virtues, and faults. His reputation has been mangled and mythologized during his absence, and his return is an attempt to put narrative control back into human hands, to tell his tale from within his home rather than through the mouths of strangers. The gods in the poem are not distant abstractions but active moral players, shaping outcomes and testing characters. Athena's favor is decisive in Odysseus's restoration, and divine justice serves as a check on human passions. Yet the gods' interventions are also inscrutable. They tilt the balance not always for the wholesome reasons a modern listener might desire. Their presence complicates the story, reminding the community that human affairs are never purely human and that sanctity and hubris are constantly in tension. Morality in Homer emerges from a weave of obligation, to family, to hospitality, to the gods, and to the community at large. These obligations frequently collide, and Odysseus's choices form a case study in how to prioritize them. The poem refuses to present an abstract moral theorem, preferring instead to lay out consequences and to let the listener weigh them. It invites an ethic grounded in ancient practice yet perpetually instructive for a world where duties are often in conflict. The theme of renewal is not purely social but psychological as well. Odysseus returns changed by his long wanderings. He has seen suffering and temptation, and his sense of self has been both hardened and deepened. Homecoming for him is thus also a reconstitution of identity, a negotiation between the man who left and the man who returns. This negotiation is painful because identity cannot be simply reinstalled, it must be reconciled with experience, and that reconciliation carries the scars of growth and loss. The process of reclaiming authority is inherently performative. The bow contest is less a tournament than a ritual test of lineage and rightful possession. By stringing the bow and shooting through the axes, Odysseus does more than display skill, he demonstrates continuity with an older regime of household authority. Such public enactments are necessary because legitimacy must be perceived by the community, not merely asserted by force. The story thus emphasizes the importance of theater and politics. Spectacle does the work of law when institutions have been eroded. The women of Ithaca are also enrolled in the drama of restoration, and their fates complicate simplistic narratives of reward and punishment. Penelope's wisdom is rewarded, but the disloyal maids are executed, their bodies treated as testimony to the cost of betrayal. The poem does not glamorize these punitive acts. Instead, it lays them starkly before the listener, asking whether such measures are purifying or merely reprisal. In doing so, the epic compels us to confront how social order is maintained at the expense of certain vulnerable figures. At the heart of the renewal process is the reestablishment of ritual practice. Sacrifices, feasts, and libations mark the transition from chaos to order and signal to the gods that balance is being restored. Such rites do not erase wrongs, but they move the community toward a shared sense of closure and continuity. In Homeric thought, ritual is the bridge between human action and divine acceptance. Without it, victory remains provisional and fragile. As Ithaca is reconstituted, attention returns to the land itself. The agrarian reality of the kingdom, olives, flocks, terraces, must be managed and defended. Land in this context is not an abstract asset but a living responsibility. It must be tilled, its yields shared, and its boundaries respected. Rekindling the economy is as crucial as purging the hall of suitors because stability depends on both moral order and material abundance. Stories are part of the economic fabric as well. They attract allies, advertise a ruler's character, and stabilize alliances. Odysseus's tale, once reclaimed, becomes a currency of esteem and a deterrent to future intrusions. A leader's reputation matters in markets and marriage negotiations, and the narrative that a ruler tells about himself is essential in shaping political reality. The act of homecoming, therefore, includes reclaiming authorship over one's own story. Forgiveness and mercy have their place in the poem, but they are sparingly dispensed and often strategic. Mercy can be an instrument of governance when it solidifies loyalty and discourages rebellion, but it can also be perceived as weakness in a fragile society. The measured clemency shown by Odysseus to some, sparing certain servants, for instance, is thus read as much for its political astuteness as for its moral warmth. The epic teaches that wisdom in rule balances severity with generosity. Language and storytelling functions as instruments of justice as well. The way Odysseus frames his own actions, the arguments he makes to the elders, the stories he permits to be told about the suitors, all become parts of the judicial record in a society where law is intertwined with rhetoric. Persuasion matters as much as brawn, and the ability to narrate events convincingly can secure peace. Thus, the poem is an instruction in the politics of narrative, showing how words can legitimize force or transform vengeance into settlement. The human cost of renewal is not negligible. Trauma lingers in those who have suffered under the suitors, and trauma shapes the laws that follow. Odysseus, for all his heroism, does little to mitigate the silent injuries of those who witnessed abuse of the household's sanctity. The poem invites the listener to think about the shadows that policy and ceremony do not reach, about the quiet griefs that remain even after the public order is restored. The notion of rightful rule is also tested by the generational moment that follows homecoming. Telemachus's ascension into maturity raises questions about succession and the reorientation of loyalty from one charismatic leader to another. For a polity to endure, the rituals of succession must be accepted and internalized, otherwise the next vacuum of power may again tempt opportunists. Odysseus's return, therefore, is as much about ensuring a stable future as it is about correcting a present wrong. Ethical leadership in the poem is often measured by the leader's capacity to integrate personal cunning with public responsibility. Odysseus's craftiness is useful in war and in survival, but the civic realm demands transparency, fairness, and an eye toward communal welfare. The text explores how a man of private talents adapts to the needs of a public office, and how those adaptations influence the laws and customs of his realm. This is a meditation on leadership that resonates beyond the ancient world. The idea of restorative justice receives subtle attention in the ways that the community seeks recompense for wrongs. Compensation, marriage alliances, and communal restitution are tools by which conflicts can be transformed into binding agreements. The elder assembly's role after the slaughter, and the negotiations that follow, show that even when violent ends mark a story, the long tail of settlement is administrative and mundane. These processes underscore how social repair is often workmanlike and slow, not the stuff of epic heroics. Memory and forgetting both play roles in the politics of renewal. Certain events are commemorated to warn against their recurrence, others are quietly effaced to allow healing. The selective memorialization that follows Odysseus's vengeance illustrates how societies curate their pasts to protect their futures. The poem suggests that choosing what to remember and what to let go of is itself a political act, one that shapes the identity of the community for generations. The moral education of the young in a post-conflict society is a subtle concern in the epic. Stories told in the hall, lessons drawn from the suitor's folly, and displays of measured punishment all instruct the next generation about the cost of transgression and the virtues of restraint. Telemachus, as a new model of governance, is taught not only by his father's deeds but by the communal responses that follow. The poem thus forwards an ethic that is meant to be internalized through narrative and example rather than imposed solely by fear. The concluding phases of the homecoming involve re-entering the world of neighboring polities and resuming the role of host in a broader network of exchange. Hospitality must be offered again, alliances must be repaired, and the ruler must once more be visible as part of a regional tapestry. This outward-facing aspect of renewal ensures that Ithaca remains secure through diplomacy as well as strength. The poem closes this loop by showing the king who can both bend a bow and break bread with allies. The moral of homecoming is also enacted in how Odysseus treats the gods and the religious life of his people. He must ritually acknowledge divine impetus for his return and show thanksgiving for the favor that allowed his restoration. Sacrifices are given not as mere formalities but as tangible acts that bind mortal action to immortal will. The poem insists that piety is a necessary component of lawful and stable rule. Throughout the narrative, the tension between the personal and the communal never fully disappears, and that is the point. Odysseus's personal vendetta becomes a matter of community because the private order is indistinguishable from the public within the fabric of Homeric society. The listener is thus compelled to think about how personal wrongs can escalate or be channeled into civic solutions, depending on the wisdom of actors and the presence of mediating institutions. The psychological portrait the poem draws of Odysseus is quietly devastating. He is a man who has paid with years the price of knowledge. He returns as someone who knows the world more completely and therefore bears a burden of recognition that others cannot share. His ability to enact the necessary violence stems from this knowledge. He perceives the threat to the household with an almost surgical clarity. Yet knowledge brings cost, and the poem allows the listener to feel the solitude that accompanies a man who has learned the hard lessons of cunning and loss. The political architecture that is re-established in Ithaca is both conservative and adaptive. It reasserts old norms but also contains innovations born of crisis. Odysseus must rely on old alliances and new practices, on both his own cunning and the cooperation of nobles, to secure a future that is less fragile than the past. In this respect, the homecoming acts as a conservative revolution. It restores the old order but transforms it enough to make it sensible again. The work of governance after triumph is therefore depicted as creative as well as restorative. Poetry and song in the hall after the events are part of the healing, serving to narrate the rightness of restoration and to honor the dead. The names of those who died might be sung in lament, the heroic tale retold as instruction, and the victories reframed to make sense of loss. Storytelling becomes civic pedagogy, shaping how future Ithacans will understand what happened and why. The poem itself participates in this function, offering its listeners a version of events meant to instruct and reconcile. The listener is drawn to contemplate the ethics of the measures taken. Were they justified, necessary, excessive, or merciful? The Odyssey refuses to grant us a tidy moral resolution, instead demanding sustained reflection. The drama's richness lies in its refusal to settle the tension between vengeance and justice into platitude. It asks that the community and the reader alike live with the ambiguities and learn from them. The poem thus remains a conversation across centuries about how humans build, break, and restore the bonds of society. Renewal in the epic is therefore not a sudden catharsis but a series of tasks that transform grief into governance. The king must hold council, distribute resources, ensure the household's dependents are cared for, and rebuild trust with neighbors. This slow work of administration is the less glamorous but more durable core of returning to rule. Homer shows that the survival of a polity depends on the mundane competence of its leader as much as on his heroic feats. It is worth noting how the poem's conclusion, less violent, more reconciliatory than one might expect, frames a political maturity that tests Odysseus. The intervention by Athena to halt further bloodshed and to orchestrate a peaceful settlement shows that the gods, when pleased, guide humanity away from endless cycles of reprisal. This divine closure privileges prudence over prolonged vengeance and turns the story from an elegy of wrath into a lesson in social restoration. It is an artistic choice that emphasizes the importance of peace after conflict. Memory of these events shapes Ithaca for generations because stories of exile and return become part of civic identity. The citizens who survive will teach their children the cost of arrogance, the value of hospitality, and the consequences of violating social norms. The poem acts as a mnemonic device for cultural education. It inscribes a narrative of caution and resilience into the social consciousness. Through recitation and myth, the ethical contours of the community are preserved. The moral tensions that color the homecoming are relevant not only to ancient polities but to any society facing the aftermath of conflict. Questions of accountability, retribution, reconciliation, and institutional reform are perennial, and the Odyssey stages them in a form that remains urgent. The epic example teaches that the restoration of order requires both sternness and mercy, both ceremony and administration, both memory and forgetfulness. These are the tools with which any society seeks to rebuild after rupture. In the closing cycles of the narrative, Odysseus must reconcile his own need for rest with the public demands of kingship. Settling into a renewed sovereignty entails accepting limitations and delegating trust to others, a process that marks a different kind of heroism, the willingness to be less solitary and more shared in authority. This is perhaps the most radical portion of the poem's politics, the suggestion that the great hero must become a better communal leader. The transformation is subtle but decisive for the future of Ithaca. The poem's final moral landscape is neither purely punitive nor entirely forgiving. It is a blended canvas where the pigments of each are carefully mixed. Odysseus's vengeance righted certain wrongs and taught others a hard lesson, but the lasting health of the community depends on deliberate acts of repair. Rituals, settlements, laws, and memory practices together create a tapestry in which justice and mercy are not opposites but partners in reconstruction. The Odyssey thus offers a template for how societies can emerge from trauma with institutions that are more just and more humane. What remains striking after a close immersion in the narrative is how human the story always is. Gods, monsters, and marvelous journeys frame the tale, but at its center are everyday obligations, the kinds of choices any community must make when trust has been broken. Odysseus's homecoming, in its combination of vengeance, justice, and renewal, models a difficult but possible path back from ruin. For listeners who drive, work, or walk as they engage with this tale, the lesson is both timely and timeless. The restoration of home is not a single triumphant moment but a gradual labor of law, ritual, and mutual care. In the end, the Odyssey calls us to hold complexity, to recognize the necessity of protecting the vulnerable, to honor the rule of law, to accept that sometimes force is required to end anarchy, and to insist that force be followed by measured reconstruction. It calls for leaders who can wield power without being consumed by it, for communities that can forgive without forgetting, and for stories that teach both the cost and the value of civic life. The homecoming to Ithaca is thus not only a tale of return but a lesson in how to rebuild a world once it has been unmade, a lesson that remains instructive across the ages.